This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion.
Coming to you live from parts unknown. Today, I bring you one of my mega episodes. 3 guests from my past. Douglas Emlen, Philip Tetlock, and Ken Blanchard. 3 very smart guys that appear to be from completely different worlds. At least in terms of their career and their intellectual firepower, they seem to be pretty different guys. But I like all 3. And they seem to be similar to me. Now, after this mega episode, I'll be curious. Do you share my point of view? First, Douglas Emlen, evolutionary biologist, one of my most favorite guests. And his book, if you've not yet read it, Animal Weapons. Grab it now. My second guest, Philip Tetlock. He's currently a professor at the Wharton School. And he has a great book as well. His book, Super Forecasting, The Art and Science of Prediction. Again, you should have that book on your shelf if you don't already. And finally, my last guest for this mega episode, Ken Blanchard. Ken has sold, 10 million books, some crazy number like that, giving a fantastic perspective on management. His classic book, The 1 Minute Manager. Let's jump right into my 3 guests today, and I hope you enjoy.
Hello, are you there?
Hey, Doug, how are you?
I am well. I just saw your message about 10 minutes ago. I'm sorry.
No. I didn't know when you were on, so sometimes people like to start earlier. I'm easygoing about it.
So it's late at night your time, huh? Or 13 hours later, anyway.
Yeah, it's 9:15 here. 9:15.
Wow.
But I've gotten used to it, because I've been doing the podcast from first year from the States, San Diego, and then the last 2 years in Asia. So I've got to actually kind of like doing the nighttime podcast because like having a conversation with someone, you just call someone up and chit chat. And
so what moved you to Asia? I mean, I read up a little bit on you just a couple minutes ago. It sounds like you've only been over there a couple of years. Is it because of investments in marketing stuff?
I was doing a speaking tour in 2013, and it was supposed to be extended like 4 months. And when it was over, I was supposed to go back to San Diego, and I was like, I really don't feel like leaving.
Wow, cool.
So that's
I'm just
simple.
Curious because most of my research is on rhinoceros beetles these days, genetics and genomics of weapons and looking at rhino beetles. And a lot of the rhino beetle diversity is right over where you are. So we do field work in Japan. We have a lot of colleagues in Japan. We're talking about sampling populations across Asia. It's a part of the world I haven't been to. I mean, I've been to Japan for 2 days. That's it. All my other stuff is Africa, Central South America. So I'm really curious to see it.
I tell you what, in terms of Vietnam, I do know there's some biodiversity in areas of Vietnam that have basically been untouched. Even with all the conflict, believe it or not, there's just, mature, deep jungles that are just, land of the lost kind of place,
Yeah, I like those kinds of places.
I imagine you do.
Those are the places they seek out. So,
well, have you heard about the cave in Vietnam?
I have not.
They've just found the largest cave in the world. There's actually a jungle growing inside the cave, or part of it collapsed. You should just Google largest cave in the world in Vietnam. It'll come up. It's insane. I mean, wow. For a guy like you, it's probably like a field day of things that no one's ever seen.
Exactly. When you get things that are isolated like that, you can get all kinds of diversity that's sort of unmatched anywhere else in the world. Neat. No, I'd never heard of it.
Yeah. So. And what's funny too is you talk about the diversity, and we move into this subject we're going to talk about today. And I was thinking to myself,
And I didn't even know where to start. I've literally got like 7 pages of notes in front of me because you kind of are going wide and deep in a lot of different areas in animal weapons. But I thought for me, I was just thinking about the subject and where you ultimately start to draw parallels. And we're going to work our way back to the dung beetles to the beginning. But I was thinking, wow, America saw what happens during, for example, Pearl Harbor with the Japanese, kind of this, all the biggest ships in the world sitting targets. And then you saw what happened in terms of fighting in Vietnam, where you show up with all the traditional troops and traditional types of fighting a war. And then all of a sudden, the people they're fighting say, oh, we don't want to fight like that. We're going to cause you problems with a different style of fighting. And so I couldn't help but think as I'm going through your book on animal weapons,
sure,
the parallels are just right there staring at me in the face. I think
the parallels are everywhere. And these are the sneak tactics, right?
Right.
These are the, if you can't play by the rules, break the rules. And asymmetric warfare like that, we were the asymmetric or the guerrillas during the Revolutionary War.
Right, exactly.
I mean, we refused to face the Brits on an open field of battle under conventional rules. And I think that this is the problem we face today as a military, pretty much wherever we go. I mean, we're dealing with pipe bombs and IEDs and suicide bombers and non-conventional warfare because nobody else has the infrastructure or the costly weapons to sort of match us toe to toe. And, if you want to talk sneaking, the problem, I'm happy to go off in any direction. And, the worst I'm going to do is piss people off with some of these ideas. But the things that scare me the most, and I don't know if I dare go there. Are you recording right now?
Sure.
Okay. Maybe I'll shut up before I go.
No. Seriously, go where you were to go. If you say something bad and we don't like it afterwards, we'll snip it and tell the audience that you said something too controversial.
Yeah, well, we can come back to the dung beetles and start with the biology and build up from first principles. It's just that once you start making these parallels, it's hard to stop. And so a couple of the scary things that emerged from this work for me, one of them was realizing that the political confrontations on the world landscape, if you will, that based on animals, we would predict would be the most dangerous, the ones that are the most likely to escalate, are matched rivalries between opponents that are sort of toe-to-toe, face-to-face, and relatively evenly armed and relatively sort of even in terms of economies and the amount that they can afford to invest into militaries. And so it makes some very quick predictions about hot spots on the globe where you've got rivals potentially with weapons of mass destruction at their disposal that are sort of going face to face. And it also makes predictions about the United States and who the most likely next big rival would be. And it's a country that I would personally prefer that we not enter into an arms race with. But all arrows point to China as the only other place out there that has the potential within the near future to match us toe to toe in this kind of a one-on-one face-off, this type of a duel. That, again, if we're going to take our lessons from animals, the lesson we learn is that's exactly the kind of confrontation that has the greatest potential to spiral out of control. So as a this isn't my realm, but it scares me when I look at the political stage and I sort of figure out what the chess pieces are likely to be. And the other thing I have to point out, you're talking about sneaky strategies, the sort of asymmetric things that we faced, the United States troops faced in Vietnam, and that the Soviets faced in Afghanistan, and that we face now in parts of the Middle East. The other sneaky strategy that nobody's talking about, or at least they're not talking about in this context, the one that really makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck, is cyber hacking. That is like the ultimate insidious sneak. And there's evidence now that again, it comes to all arrows point to China, but that there are hackers that are infiltrating our military infrastructure and our software systems that we need to fly our fighter planes or to navigate our aircraft carriers or to guide our missiles. And that's interesting because you can have these incredibly sophisticated, expensive weapons that are amazing in what they're capable of. And then you can have essentially a shoestring budget style sneak strategy that worms its way in there and completely undermines the effectiveness of these most state-of-the-art weapons. And there's all kinds of little hints that this is happening, but I don't think people are sort of connecting the dots that way, and it scares the daylights out of me.
In defense of China, to play devil's advocate, I would hazard a guess
that they are not the only ones involved in cyber espionage. I'm sure we are too.
Point taken. Point taken.
I'm sure. And I tell you what, there was something else interesting too that I want to bring up, and then we're going to work back to the animals. I had a guest on last year, early 80s, won the Nobel Prize in game theory, a guy named Robert Aumann, and we got to talking about the Cold War. And he said, and we started talking about, and again, this goes right into your work, started talking about that, to avoid the war, you can't just yell peace. Okay. From his perspective, and this is a mathematical perspective, the game theory perspective, the John Nash perspective was you have to be prepared to fight. And then when you are prepared to fight, when you are at the point where both sides know you're prepared to fight, then there's no war. And he pointed out, he said, 40 years, the USSR and USA had bombers in the sky 24/7 loaded with nukes. And that kept the peace. Now, of course, you and I can immediately say, well, God, that really sucks that we had to do that. But then again, that's our world, right? Isn't it? I mean, you can't put the genie back in the thing again. And so I thought it was interesting that, but doesn't that parallel right with the animal weapons?
And again, I should just add, it totally does. And I guess I have to add the caveat that, I don't come at this from that perspective. I come at this as a biologist, and I came at this from a family upbringing that is very anti-war. In fact, on one side of my family, going back to the 1600s, they were all Quakers. I mean, I don't come at this from a rah-rah big armies perspective at all. But there I was, pouring through the literature, looking at all these stories and animals, and that is exactly the conclusion that I came to as well. And it stunned me. I mean, it really shocked me that there I was as a scientist doing what we do as scientists and connecting the logical dots and drawing the patterns that we infer from the data that we collect. And that was the inescapable conclusion. And there are animal parallels. So let
me give you one animal. Let me let you start with one animal, and then we're going to work back to the beginning with the dung beetles.
Perfect.
Go ahead and talk about the fiddler crab and connect the fiddler crab to the Soviet and USA bombers in the sky 24/7, and they don't have to fight. And the fiddler crab is waving that big old claw. And generally, they don't want to fight either, do they?
You got it. So fiddler crabs, I mean, they're the champions in terms of animal weapons. And most people can picture in their head at least roughly what these things look like. But just to put it into scale, these males have sort of two sets of arms or appendages coming off the front of their body. One of them is this little tiny one that they use to feed, and the other one is huge. It's this massive claw that they wave up and down and that they use in fights. And these claws are packed with muscle, and the males wrestle with these claws. The males invest 100% of their body weight in this weapon. That means they're doubling their body weight. They're producing a full copy of their body and carrying it around as a weapon. And by any metric you want to come up with, that's a staggering proportion of sort of material resources that are allocated to this weapon. So it's relative to body size, it's the biggest weapon of any animal ever. And these males are out there producing these huge claws. They're dragging these things around. These claws are expensive. They cost a lot of energy to make. They're dangerous for these guys to carry. They make them really obvious targets. They slow them down. I mean, imagine running with 150 pounds of gear stuffed in your arms. It slows you down. And so there's a price associated with these things. But these males invest all of this into the weapons because it helps them win fights over access to females. But where you're going with this is that these animals have these huge weapons, but they actually don't fight as often as you think that they would. They have tons of confrontations with rivals. Rival crabs face off in the sand by the thousands any given night on these beaches that are just covered with these crabs. But the males are waving them up and down as a signal. It's like this big billboard saying, I can clobber you. My weapon is bigger. And the males size each other up, and they line up against each other, and they wave their claws, and the guys with the smaller claws walk away. And they walk away for a good reason. It's because the size of the weapon accurately, honestly predicts the likelihood that the male is going to win. A male with a bigger weapon is in better condition, does have more resources able to pour into the conflict. Those are the guys that are most likely to win. And so what happens is all these fights end up getting resolved essentially peacefully, because the males will stand off and they'll wave and they'll bluster, and then the little guy walks away, and there's no fight and there's no injury. Nobody gets killed in the fray. And so there are a couple, you see this to some extent in lots of animals with weapons, that the bigger the weapons get, the more visible they become as a signal, the more honest they become as a signal of fighting ability, the more effectively they function as deterrents. And when you get to the animals like the fiddler crabs with the biggest weapons of all, most of their fights, I mean, really, most of the contests end up not being battles. They're not dangerous. The other animal that's worth mentioning is the caribou, because caribou have the largest antlers relative to their body size of any vertebrate, of any sort of warm-blooded animal with a skeleton on the inside. And these guys hardly ever fight. One of my favorite studies that I came across pouring through the literature was the study that looked at like 11,000 contests between rival males. Only 6 escalated into knockdown, drag-out battle. So yeah, these are weapons. Antlers are weapons, and they can be used to fight, and the fights can be deadly. But because the antlers make good deterrents, good signals of fighting ability, and because it pays to pay attention to those signals, these animals with the biggest weapons are the most peaceful. They hardly ever fight. So yeah, it was a little scary to extrapolate that to our modern world and to try to come to the conclusion then that sometimes the best way to be safe is to have the most effective, the most expensive, the most state-of-the-art weaponry.
It's counterintuitive.
It is. Now there's problems, right? That works in principle. And it may mean that most of the time you're safe. But even in the animals, if you look closely, there are still situations where the confrontations precipitate out of control. And in those cases, the fights can be really, really bad because these guys are heavily armed. And so we always run that risk too. The idea is that we may be safer on average, and the majority of conflicts may be resolved without fights because we have really effective war-making capabilities and it works as a deterrent. But it doesn't mean that it always works. And if it ever breaks down, then there you are with these sort of stunning weapons and facing the reality of actually having to use them.
Okay, I'm going to get you to pause in the breaks down part on mass destruction weapons, and I'm going to come back to that at the end. But right now, what I want to do first is tell you one more thing about me, and then I want you to define something as we start.
Okay.
Back at my house in Virginia, I actually have a scale replica of a Triceratops skull and a scale replica of a T-Rex skull. So I didn't go as far as you did as a little boy never growing up, but I've
came pretty close, actually. That's awesome.
I've tried to stay close that I have these scale replicas, the price of cars in my house. But anyways, here's where I want you to go. I want you to define out of the gate for people an evolutionary biologist, which is what you are.
Okay. That's not where I thought you were going to go with the Triceratops and the T-Rex skulls.
Well, we could come back to that, but I want you to define. I haven't got you to define you yet first.
Well, yeah, because people have a right to know who's this guy and why is he talking about politics and militaries and things like that. I'm an evolutionary biologist. What that means is I study natural populations of organisms in their element. So in my case, it's beetles. I've studied a number of different species of beetles. I've studied them in Central America. I've studied them in South America, in Africa, all over the world. And I'm interested in diversity in animal morphology. So for me, that means the weapons. I have a soft spot for these sort of extreme structures, and I study animals that produce things that are sort of outlandish and disproportionate and they make these animals look like they should tip over or trip. And you look at they're like a Triceratops. You look at an animal like that and it's like, how is that possible? Well, as an evolutionary biologist, we study how is that possible. I look at what these traits function for in the wild. And I look at why individuals with, in my case, bigger weapons might perform better or might reproduce more effectively than other individuals with smaller weapons. So we're looking at the forces out there in natural populations that shape the turnover, if you will, among individuals and cause some individuals to succeed more than others. We're interested in why certain subsets of the population do better than others and why populations tend to change over time in the directions that they do. Why do some populations change in a direction where the weapons get bigger and bigger and bigger, and other populations go in a different direction and the weapons disappear? As an evolutionary biologist, we're interested in the diversity. Why do some species have these traits and others not? And we're interested in the processes, the details of the things that unfold on the ground that cause those populations to diverge like that. And nowadays, it's a lot of genetics. I spend a lot of time looking at the genomes of these animals, looking at the developmental mechanisms that cause cells to grow into something like a weapon, and what kinds of physiological pathways and genes direct that development. And then if I want to know why one population has big weapons and another one has small weapons, I can sort of open the hood, if you will, look inside at what's going on in these animals, and we can start to get a sense, we hope to be able to get a sense for what types of mutations to what types of genes actually sort of spontaneously popped up in these populations that caused them to have different weapon shapes or sizes. And those animals then did differentially depending on their weapons. And these are the kinds of sort of historical events that unfolded to give you diversity in weapon form.
Doug,
so I wasn't ready for that question. I don't know if I articulated that clearly, but I'm interested in diversity. I'm interested in how populations change over time, why they change over time. And now we're at the level where we're really interested in the genes, the actual, sort of looking under the hood, the molecular biology processes that are unfolding that permit populations to change over time. In my case, it can be crazy things like animal weapons, but the phenomena that I study are no different than things that modern people studying evolution in medicine are studying. Why is it that a disease changes the way as it does? Why do we have to get flu shots every year? Because the flu virus evolves so rapidly that the vaccines we generate one year are ineffective at matching the strains of the virus that are out there the next year. That is one of the most rapid evolutionary phenomena anywhere. And so the kinds of things I study might be in the rainforest on beetles with horns, but they're actually the same things that people with the CDC are studying left and right to try to figure out where the next disease is going to come from and what direction it's going to evolve.
Pick an example of a particular arms race, an animal weapons arms race in your mind. Pick a fascinating one and lead me through look, I'm a nimble animal right now. I don't have any great armaments, but something starts to happen. So maybe there's a mutation in my brother. And my brother, he's got a little bit bigger something. And then maybe lead me through that process, pick an animal, and how that arms race starts to happen.
All right, I'm going to pick one of my favorite animals. It's one that most people don't spend a lot of their waking hours thinking about. It's the dung beetle. Everybody's heard of dung beetles. Many people have seen dung beetles. Most people haven't really thought about them, and most people are completely unaware of the kinds of weapons that some of these species have. So say you're a beetle, and if you're a male beetle, then everything in your world is about reproduction. I mean, your whole life flashes before your eyes, and whether you make it or not is entirely dependent on whether you're able to fight your way to access to a female. Well, if you happen to be a species of beetle that lives and fights inside a tunnel, and many of the dung beetles do this, right? They fly into cow manure or horse manure, whatever the particular type of dung might be. We study them in Africa. It could be elephant dung. You fly into a pile of elephant dung and you burrow through it. And then beetles tend to do one of two things. Some species carve a hunk of the dung off into a ball. They sculpt it into a sphere and they push it away from everything else as fast as possible. And just to get you into this scene, if you will, there's a lot of competition. You fly into a pile of elephant dung in the Serengeti, and you might have to face 50,000 rival beetles of all these different species that are all piling into this and all trying to carve that up and steal it and use it for themselves and use it to feed their own young. And so there's this intense pile of beetles all competing for this food source. So one way you get around the competition is you carve a ball and you push it away from everybody else as fast as possible. Well, if you do that, you're a male beetle, you carve your ball, you roll away with it, you're not going to get away unscathed. First of all, females are going to find the ball and go with you. That's great. That's like the whole story right there. If you can get a female to follow you with your dung ball, you get away from everybody else. You can mate with the female, bury that food, and everything is golden. Problem is all these other males are going to challenge you, and they're going to pile on top of you and pull at you and try to pull you off that dung pile. They're going to scramble around, and you're going to have 4, 5, 6 different beetles all fighting for this food source as you try to get it away. A different kind of beetle goes into that same elephant dung pile and instead of carving a ball, goes into a tunnel underground. So females of these species excavate burrows like tubes into the soil underneath the dung, and they pull the dung down into the tubes, and that's their way to get it away from the competition. Well, if you're that kind of beetle, you go into one of these burrows and you plant yourself at the entrance and you block that entrance and you make sure no other males get in there. And now you've got the female inside the tunnel beneath you, and you're blocking the gate, so to speak, and none of the other rival competitor males can get by. So in both of these cases, you've got males fighting other males to get access to females. But that one difference in behavior makes all the difference in the world. So now say your mutation pops up, your brother or you in this case, and you've got a little knob on your body that's a bit bigger than it was before, something that, sticks out like a little itty bitty horn. Well, if you're fighting in a big scramble, that's not really going to do much. You can't brace yourself very well. There's no way to use that little knob like you would to open the lid on a soda bottle or something like that. You can't use it to pry very well. You're scrambling around out in the open. And if anything, agility is going to matter. And if that little knob you produce is actually pretty expensive, you wouldn't want to be wasting any resources on it because it's not going to do you any good. If that little knob, that mutation arises that makes a knob on a beetle that's inside a tunnel, then everything's different. I mean, basically, they're both dung beetles. They're in the same place. They're fighting over females. They're doing the same thing. But in this case, because you're in a tunnel and because you're blocking the tunnel, a knob like that gives you an edge because now you can block that tunnel better. Another beetle tries to force his way past you, and you've got a hook now, literally like a bottle top opener that you can use to grab onto the edge of his sort of shield, the thorax part of him, and pry him out. And if that knob gets even bigger, you can use it like the bars on a jail cell to literally block off the tunnel so that nobody else can push their way by. So here's a situation where you can push into the sides of the tunnel with your legs and lock yourself in there. And you can use that knob on your head, that horn, to pry or to twist or to block the tunnel. And so in that situation, having a little knob makes a huge difference. And in that particular situation, the males that tend to have the biggest knobs or the biggest horns are the ones that have an edge. And that's some of the stuff that we did and a number of other biologists have done. We've been able to watch tons of fights. And if you're fighting inside a tunnel, the bigger bodied beetle and the beetle with the bigger weapons, those are the guys that win. So males with longer weapons win. So what that means is that animal, because of that knob, has a better shot at protecting the tunnel, a better shot at mating with the female, a better shot at siring lots of offspring because he got access to the female. The next generation of that population, then offspring are going to inherit alleles or whatever it is about the genotypes of these animals that cause there to be that little knob. And that's going to be a little bit more common in the population than it was before. And those kids are going to do really well because they've got the bottle top opener. So when they get into fights, they do better than animals without that. And the next generation, their progeny are going to be even more numerous. And the next generation after that. And pretty soon, the population evolves. It turns over so that everybody now has that little knob. And now, say somebody comes up with a mutation that has an even bigger one. So now everybody's got a knob of some sort, but some of these males have really big ones. Those guys win over the ones with the smaller ones. Their kids are the ones that are the most numerous, and then their kids, and then their kids. And then very quickly the population moves, it sort of ratchets up a notch till the weapon's a little bit bigger.
I think of something else that comes up in the human population. And being in my mid-40s, I'm old enough to have watched the maturation of all the pro sports leagues, etc. And you don't need much of a pulse to be able to recognize names and the number. I don't care whether you're white or black or what sport you're in, but the number of guys that were pro athletes when I was a teenager, my early 20s, that now are starting to have kids that are superstars as pro athletes. You know, look, there's nurture, there's nature. Not everybody's, not Michael Jordan, not every one of his sons has become the next Michael Jordan, but clearly there's something at play, and we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it.
I didn't prep for this, and I'll get the details wrong, but there is. So there's a number. I mean, so studies of human genetics are just, they're incredible these days. They're moving spectacularly rapidly, and we have more genomics resources for sort of understanding things at a genetic level in humans now than for anything else out there, for obvious and good reasons. And so what people are doing is they're scouring through the genome looking for, you know, mutations and variations in particular alleles of particular genes that seem to correlate with disease traits or with other types of traits that people are interested in. And they begin by trying to sort of form an association. They look for sort of a statistical match between a particular variant of a gene and being a really good athlete, for example, or having a propensity to a certain disease. And once they start making these associations, then the geneticists and again, evolutionary biologists can zoom in and start looking in mice and in other model systems. What happens if we perturb this gene? Do we change the traits that we care about? And they can start to come up with functional links between particular genes and particular traits. And I'm not going to remember the names of the genes in this case, but yes, there are studies now that are showing that there are particular variants of certain genes that affect the way your cells use oxygen, that make you more efficient. So for the same amount of circumstance or the same amount of air some individuals are more efficient at using that oxygen than others. There are alleles that affect muscle properties. There are actually logical genetic underpinnings to why some people have really, really good athletic performance. And it's not as simple as that, right? I mean, the kinds of things that make a sprinter are different from the kinds of things that make a marathon runner. And you look at a football field and you look at the body size and the muscle build and the differences among individuals. A lot of that is not inheritance of particular alleles. It's training and it's diet and it's other things that people do. But you can see pretty quickly that there are different types of traits that are specialized for or that perform especially well for particular functions, whether you're a running back or an offensive lineman. And again, some of that is going to be driven by training and by diet, but a lot of that, I think we're realizing the kinds of sort of predispositions to be really small and light and fast, or to be really big and bulky and wide, those kinds of things I won't be surprised at all if we can start to find really clear genetic underpinnings for. So no, there are loads of things you can start to look at in people where we can start to figure out, at least at some level, what genetic variation sort of predisposes people. But I want to be clear about something. If you're going to, I'm going the directions you're taking me here. And that wasn't
I'm not going anywhere. I'm just wandering around the playing field. I'm just looking under the hood and seeing what's there. What do you mean? I'm not leading you anywhere.
No, I didn't mean it that way. I just meant that I would have done my homework and I would have actually had the names of the genes in question.
Okay, listen. Okay, here's where I want to go next. Okay, so
I want to make one thing clear though. What we're finding, it's not as simple as saying, oh, I have a gene for this trait and therefore I'm going to have this disease, or I'm going to be an incredible athlete. What we're learning is that the interesting biology is at the interface of genes and the environment. It's the way that particular alleles in your genome interact with the diet choices you make or the lifestyle choices you make. There's actually an interaction between those two. And so what happens is you might inherit an allele. You might have a very strong family history for cancer or for alcoholism. It doesn't mean you're going to be an alcoholic or you're going to get cancer, because there isn't a gene for this. But what it means is, because of the alleles you inherit, if you were to line up 100 people and expose them to the same sets of environmental circumstances, some of them, maybe you, because of the allele you inherit, are going to be more likely to develop cancer in response to those situations than others. So there's sort of an inherited predisposition or a propensity towards a particular condition like cancer or alcoholism. If you don't drink, you can't become an alcoholic. But you line up 100 people and you give them the same sort of alcohol regimen, and not all of them are going to become alcoholics. Some of them are. And we can start to explain why some people have sort of an inherited predisposition that makes them more likely or more prone than others. So yeah, there's some very exciting genetic studies coming out there, but it's important to put them in context and understand that it doesn't mean that there's a gene for the trait and, oh, I inherit this allele, I'm screwed. But it does mean that you might want to change your behavior. You might want to be aware that in my case, it's heart disease. I have a family history of heart issues. Knowing that helps me make different diet choices than I would otherwise. And it helps me exercise more than I otherwise would. It makes it a higher priority for me because I know that I have an inherited predisposition towards things. So that's the way to think about it. And it can be transformative and constructive.
Clarification well taken. Okay, so here's where I want to take you back to.
Let's go back to Beatles.
I'm going to take you away from Beatles for a second to something a little more sexy.
Wait a minute.
Listen, I can't convince you that Beatles aren't sexy. I know how much time you spent with Beatles, okay? I understand.
Beatles are the triceratops of the insect world, and you told me you love triceratops. So.
Go with me for a second. So we've talked about the arms race and how an arms race can happen in the beetle population. But then eventually something like an arms race, as you state, it can run its course. And I think it'd be an interesting example because this was one of my favorite animals as a kid. And not until I was an adult, and frankly, not until I started doing this podcast, am I going back and reading about, I think was the technical name would be Smilodon. Would that be correct? So I going back and understanding that big old saber-toothed cat that I thought was so cool when I was a kid was kind of, not a sleek body, not a big runner, and was a guy that basically his front two teeth had gotten so long, he just hung out in a tree and wait for a mastodon to come by, right? Explain how an arms race can start to run its course with something like the saber-toothed cat.
Okay. Yes. So in the situation I set up with the beetles, and that's relevant to the fiddler crabs and it's relevant to caribou, These are situations where the weapons are borne by the males, and the males are using them in battles over access to females. So the context or the backdrop for all of this is competition over access to reproduction. That's the currency that matters. And so the weapons tend to only be in the males, and they get used in this certain type of a contest. And that is the most common sort of natural scenario that leads to extraordinarily rapid arms race evolution of ridiculous weapon sizes. Sexual selection is what it's called when males compete for access to females, or when members of one sex, it can go the other way around. Members of one sex, male or female, compete for access to the other. That's sort of the most pervasive, most widespread phenomenon that tends to lead to extravagance and to the evolution of these things that are absurd. But as you point out, Smilodon, so the saber-tooths, are another. And that's not a situation, the big canine teeth in these guys, and they're amazing. And you said you have a Triceratops in your house. I have a life-size replica of a Smilodon or a saber-tooth skull on my desk in my office. I love it. I walked into that assuming, of course, it works like all these other weapons. Surely those big teeth are just in the males, not in the females. And surely it has to do with fighting over access to females. I was wrong. That's not true. And at first I didn't believe it. I was going through the literature like, this can't be right. How come they're not talking about sexual selection? How come they're not talking about male competition? And I finally had to contact some of the paleontologists, and they're like, no, you're wrong. Everybody had the big teeth. Males had the big teeth. Females had the big teeth. These were not structures used in competition for access to reproduction. They're used by predators. And that actually threw me for a loop, because when you look at predators, most predators don't have really big weapons, and it's for a pretty obvious reason. They slow you down. They get really awkward, and you can't run fast, or if you're a fish, you can't swim fast, or if you're a bird, you can't fly fast. You can't move fast if you're carrying this big, clunky, awkward weapon around. And so if you're a predator, that's usually the end. I mean, if you can't catch your food, it doesn't really matter how big your weapons are. And so the interesting thing that the Smilodon, where it's sort of this thorn in my side. It's like, here's this animal with an incredible weapon, and it just didn't fit the pattern. And for me, it was one of those epiphanies when all the pieces finally clicked into place. And I was reading this paper about the saber-tooths, coming at all the specimens they'd gotten in the La Brea tar pits, and they're talking about what they think these animals did. And you hit it on the head. These guys were not able to run fast. They were awkward. They were thick and heavy and gangly. And you know, if you think about their faces, they couldn't have run fast. Their heads are squashed backwards. So these teeth sort of project forward. They can't even look at where they're going. So these are clumsy animals. And these people in this little paragraph in this paper say, well, we think they were ambush predators. And that was it. That was like, boom, everything clicked into place. And I started realizing, my God, an ambush predator, they don't have to run fast. They're not a cheetah. They don't have to chase down prey. They sit there and they wait for the prey to come to them. And that's a fundamentally different hunting strategy. But as soon as you do that, you change the game, because all of a sudden it doesn't matter if you're awkward or you're gangly. What matters is, can you catch that prey really quickly? And in a lot of these situations, big weapons are better. And so in the case of the saber-tooth, they think that these guys hung out on trees. They hung out up in trees, and they dropped from trees onto unsuspecting prey. And the best guess, as far as I know, is sort of lumbering juvenile mastodons and mammoths. So you've got your little baby elephant walking by, and all of a sudden this thing with like 10-inch daggers drops out of the tree, plunges those things into the back of the neck, and kills the prey. They don't have to run. They're not a cheetah. All they have to do is drop onto their unsuspecting prey. And so once that sort of piece to the puzzle clicked and I started looking around, I realized this is true everywhere. My kids love Finding Nemo. Remember the viper fish in Finding Nemo with this? It's just basically a mouth with huge teeth that was down in the deep sea. That was a cartoon character, but it's a caricature of true to life viper fish and angler fish. There's a whole suite of these deep sea monsters. They're ambush predators. They use little dangling globs of light as a lure to pull the prey into them. They don't have to swim fast. These aren't tuna. These things sit there and they wait till the prey come to them, and then boom, they grab them with these massive jaws. You see the same thing with alligator gar with these long jaws. You see it with praying mantids. So yeah, you hit on something there. There is a whole separate context out there in nature that can lead to the evolution of extreme weapons. And it's when predators that presumably used to be the traditional run them down, chase them down predators change their behavior, and they start adopting a sit and wait or an ambush tactic.
Yeah, no, I was thinking of another example to throw at you about just something from my world that I think parallels with this notion of an arms race. And if I look at the trading world, for example, so all the rage right now is for people to have faster and faster trading. So I don't know, they want to trade the speed of light. So it all becomes very resource dependent. I mean, servers on top of servers. You have to get closer. There's been a lot of books about this. You have to get closer to the exchanges, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's one way to think about it. And there's a huge arms race there. However, there is a very—
I've never thought about that.
There's a very sizable population of extremely successful traders that go just the opposite direction. They maybe trade what we call a weekly bar. So they trade one day, the closing price of the stock market once a week. And they only make their decisions off the closing price of the stock market once a week. So all these other guys are out there trying to trade at the speed of light because they think the faster they can get ahead of everybody. And there's other people that are saying, hey, hold on. We don't want to have all those resources. We don't want to have—
Can I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
I'm making an instant prediction based on what you're saying. These people that take that plan B, they don't play by the rules. They're not investing everything in these really fast servers. Are they saving?
You already
resources?
know.
Are they? I mean, are they?
You already know who wins.
Some staggering price.
Here's the thing. Look, the high frequency guys, the ones that have got the rigged game, of course they're making money. Okay, but it's kind of like a rigged kind of thing, and who knows if that lasts, right? Maybe that's something for right now. But you're thinking right that the people that are using less resources are a little more nimble, and maybe their quality of life is different. But yeah, the people that kind of look at less data and a longer time horizon can do just as well, if not better, and they don't have to stay in that arms race of the fastest servers and the fastest connections and all that kind of stuff.
I love it. I've never thought about that example. I love it, and it's a perfect fit. This is exactly what you see in animals. So you get the biggest males that are investing just obscene amounts of resources in these weapons, and for the biggest of the big, the males with the biggest weapons, it's worth it because they win and they are able to get access to the females, and they might get access to lots of females, and all that time that means there's all these other males that aren't getting anything at all. So to the victor go the spoils, in a sense. And if you can play that game with the best resources and the biggest weapons and win, you do really well. But these males are investing enormous resources in these things. And so if you look at some of the studies on antlers in elk or in the deer family, these guys are leaching so much calcium and phosphorus in order to make the antlers that they're pulling it out of their own skeletons, and they're going through this sort of brittle boned seasonal form of osteoporosis just so that they can shunt everything into the production of the weapons. I mean, it's deficit spending. They're depleting their own reserves that they need to survive to make these weapons. And you look at some of the beetles, and they're putting so much into these weapons that they're stunting their eyes, and their wings are smaller, and their testes are smaller. So they're like, they're doing all this so they can mate, and then they can't even produce as much sperm because they had to shunt resources away from their testes to make these big weapons. So you're paying this huge price. And so what do you do if you're not the biggest male in the game? You can pour all these resources into this expensive technology, so to speak, the weapons, but you're not going to win. Go the opposite way. And that's what they do. They ditch it. They stop producing the weapons. They shunt everything into something else, and they adopt a plan B. They sneak. They do something else and break the rules.
Go to the octopus example with the color changing and the smaller octopus male that gets around these limitations that we're talking about of the alpha. And still the octopus is not the alpha, but he's figured out a way around the system.
Yeah. So this, all right. I love this story. So first, just to connect the dots though, the beetles that we just talked about, you're in the tunnel, you're a big beetle, you've got huge weapons, you're fighting to block the tunnel. What happens in the beetles is there's little males that don't even produce the horns at all. They've got really big testes, really big genitalia. They are good dispersers. And instead of fighting, they dig a little side tunnel and they mine their way in underground, and they're able to get around the big guy guarding the gate. And they can get into the tunnel beneath them by mining their way in. And then they can mate with the female on the sly. So they're not producing weapons. They're not fighting. They're not investing in armaments or fighting or any of that stuff, and they sneak around to do an end game and they get in. So the one you're mentioning is one of the slickest of these, and it's related to the octopus, but it's the cuttlefish actually. And what they do, these guys they're really quick at changing their body color. So they can go up against sort of rocks on the bottom of the ocean and change in a second or two and match that pattern so that they just blend, they vanish into the background because they're so good at hiding, and they're sort of mimicking the stippling pattern and all the colors of the pebbles and the gravel and the stuff beneath them. And so these are animals that have extraordinary abilities to change color. And so what you're getting at is in the mating season, and again, this isn't my work, this is just an incredible literature that's out of people like Roger Hamlin that have done this stuff. But what they find is that these cuttlefish, the big males, during the breeding season, they turn into something that's the underwater equivalent of a peacock. They produce beautiful purples and greens and this rich sort of tapestry of color on their bodies that's this big display to attract females. Well, if you're a little guy, you're not able to produce as big or as bright a display. You're not going to win at that game. You're not as attractive as the biggest, sexiest guys out there. What do? So they cheat. And what they'll do is they'll mimic a female. They'll put on a color pattern that makes them look like a female. And then they can swim right up to that big displaying male. The big guy's up there with his billboard, and he's got a female right next to him that he's mating with. The little guy, by pretending to be a female, can get right up to that big male. He's not going to challenge him or push him away because he looks like a female. He can get right up in there, and he can actually sidle his way, wiggle his way in between the male and the female while they're courting. And then as soon as he gets in there, he's slid right in there so that he's in between the big male and the female. He changes his color again. And on the side of his body where the male can see him, he still looks like a female. But the other side of his body, the side of his body that the female can see, he changes into a really bright colored male display. So he's like a two-toned animal, and the female looks and sees another male. The male that he's literally right up against looks and sees a female, and he's able to slide in there and mate with the female on the sly by cheating, essentially, by breaking the rules and by playing around with color in a really clever way.
You know, if you bring that back to my example, I was talking about trading, it's the creativity and the industriousness to say, okay, even though maybe the deck is stacked against me, there's a workaround. And that's exactly what you're talking about, the cuttlefish. There's a workaround. The deck, I mean, because you hear all these people in life, they say, oh, the deck's stacked against me. I didn't inherit Shaquille O'Neal's gene pool. I can't do this. I can't do that. There's always a workaround if you want to spend the time, right?
Yeah, and that's how it works in most animal populations too. You know, there are a small subset of individuals that have it all. They're born into wealth, so to speak. They've got really healthy, dominant parents that they're born with better immune systems, better access to nutrition, better territories. Everything is stacked in their favor. But it doesn't mean that the rest of the animals in these populations give up. They find workarounds, and there are so many neat examples of workarounds. You asked at the beginning, I'm an evolutionary biologist. What do I do? Well, one of the things that's really fun to do as an evolutionary biologist is to look at all the ways that animals have solved this problem and to figure out the kinds of crazy, quirky workarounds that these animal populations have stumbled on, because there's some fun ones, like the cuttlefish. I mean, how cool is that?
Yeah, it's awesome. I mean, it's crazy. The parallels are crazy because I caught something in an article where you got some good bit of press somewhere, and I caught it and I reached out to you and I was like, I had not read your book. I had not bought your book yet. And then I started going through it. I'm like, man, this is crazy. The parallels are just, it just jumps off the page if you're like, wow, you're forced to, I mean, I'm thinking movies somewhere. I don't know. But, okay, I've only got you for a little bit more here.
Sure.
Let's wind down to the arms race. And two things that I want to put in people's head to think about, for example, battleships. You know, battleships, there's no need for a battleship, or there hasn't been for a long time, but they looked great. You can think about the British Empire, trying to manage, was it 25% of the world's population? It becomes unmanageable. But where I wanted to, just getting people to think about some of the topic areas that you go into, we can't go into everything today, but the last thing I wanted to end with was going back to what we started with, was basically, how they call it in war games, thermonuclear war, whatever it is. Okay, so the way that it worked during the Cold War, you had two powers in a nuclear detente. Okay, so but what happens? And you kind of hint about this in your book. What happens if there's more than two actors? There's 5 actors. There's 10 actors, and then let's say that those actors don't all have the same cultures and the same understandings. In hindsight, the leaders in Moscow and the leaders in Washington, D.C. probably had very similar outlooks to some degree. But what happens if nukes are the final toy to be used and there's no coming back. What happens if too many actors have nukes? And I think I know where you ultimately are going to go with that thought. And I think it's hard for people to disagree that there's probably going to be a point in time where something bad happens.
Yes, it's a fairly scary conclusion when you follow the logical train that I set up in this book. And so I'm trying to think how to do it quickly and how to get where you want to go.
You can talk as long as you want.
Oh, I can, because you brought up a bunch of things.
Go ahead.
First of all, just to make the point, again, I come at this from biology. What I did is I stepped back from having worked on beetles, and I went through the literature, and I started looking at examples of arms races in lots of different kinds of animals, in everything I could find. And I did it, first of all, because I wanted to tell the stories of these crazy, these are wonderful, amazing, bizarre animals. They look like freaks of nature. And I like that. I wanted to understand what makes them tick and why they look and act the way that they do. While doing that, it became increasingly clear that whether I was talking about a little moose fly in New Guinea or a mastodon, the stories were the same, that these animals were incredibly different in every aspect I could think of their life, where they lived, what they ate, how big they were. Everything they did was different except for the weapons. They all had huge weapons. And the more I looked, the more I realized they all had these weapons for the same reasons. So the same kinds of circumstances, the stars had to align in exactly the same way in order for these populations to launch into an arms race. And so once I started realizing there is sort of a common theme, there's a core set of criteria that can trigger an arms race, then I started looking much more closely at the arms race phenomenon. What happens once it begins? How does it unfold? Why do they end? And all of these things turned out to be parallel across these species too. Around the same time, my editors were like, hey, you got to look at human weapons too. And my first reaction is, no way, I'm a biologist. But they kept saying, no, I think there's something here. Dig a little deeper and look. And I started reading the military literature. And that's when I started getting really blown away, because I realized that there are everything that was sort of a common element that could explain an arms race in an animal also applied when we started looking at our own military technologies. And that was the sort of realization that took this book to the next level and took me to the next level. And I started going crazy, pulling all these things together and trying to look for parallels and trying to figure out what starts arms races in our military traditions. Is it the same kinds of conditions? And once the arms races start, are they going to unfold in the same way? And when they collapse, are they going to collapse in the same way? And the answer I kept coming back to is yes, it's exactly the same. And then right around the time I was starting to get excited, but I was still nervous because I'm not a military historian, I stumbled on the work of a military historian, Robert O'Connell, who writes, in my opinion, brilliant sort of analyses of military history, who's gone into arms races and asked exactly the same questions, and he'd come to almost exactly the same conclusions. So here's a military guy with specialties in arms races and military who's looking at biology for parallels, and I'm a biologist looking at the military for parallels, and we're meeting in the middle and coming to astonishingly similar conclusions. And that's when I realized, my God, this is real. And so I started running with that. And what this book is sort of portraying how this process unfolds and trying to set up these parallels. You mentioned battleships. So battleships are relevant for lots of reasons, but one of them is the thing that starts the arms race, this kind of one-on-one interaction, turns out to be, I haven't really talked about it here, but one of the things that's this crucial prerequisite for the competition type, not the predator arms races, but the male-male competition, the battle type arms races, is a duel, a one-on-one confrontation between rivals that unfolds in a very predictable fashion. And that predictability is essential, because that's what makes it cost effective to invest in weapons. If the male with the bigger weapons really is going to win, then you, by God, want to have the biggest weapons. If the fights aren't predictable, if there's a huge stochastic component to it, then it's not worth spending a lot to build a weapon, because it might not matter. It might not determine the outcome. And so explaining arms races meant explaining what are the circumstances where the outcome of fights become the most predictable. And once you could identify that, you could explain when weapons got big in animals, and you could explain when weapons got really extravagant in people. The problem is, and you sort of touched on it, is that the crucial condition that makes these expensive weapons worthwhile is this predictable outcome, this sort of one-on-one contest. And when you start getting 3, 4, 5, 6 different animals in the fray, everything starts to break down. It gets really chaotic and really unpredictable and really dangerous. And so the dung beetles, where they carve the balls and they're all wrestling and tussling around on the surface, those fights aren't predictable. It's not worth having a weapon. And none of the ball-rolling dung beetles ever have weapons. Only inside the tunnel, where the males fight one-on-one. In a tunnel, you have to fight one-on-one. because you have to crawl into the tunnel to confront a rival, and only one rival can fit in the tunnel at a time. And you got to walk into the tunnel so you face your opponent face to face, one-on-one in a duel. So being in a tunnel makes it predictable and consistent, and that can lead to arms races. So when you start talking about big weapons in politics and landscapes, if you've got a duel like the Soviet Union, the USSR, and the United States locked head-to-head, that's a one-on-one showdown. That's a predictable type of escalation that's just like what we see in animals. When you start getting a whole lot of other states in the game, the numbers of degrees of freedom, the ways that this thing can play out become sort of astronomically complex. And one of the conclusions you come to is the really big weapons aren't cost effective. They're not worth it in that kind of contest. It's too dangerous and it's too unpredictable. That sort of safety factor that you get from deterrence won't work when it's too complicated. And there's one last thing. I know I'm rambling for a while here, but one more point I want to make on that. One of the other things that comes out of this parallel, this logic, is that, this thing that you talked with me about a little bit earlier today, why are we safer with big weapons? Well, we're safer with big weapons if those really big weapons are honest signals of who's likely to win a fight, and if we're sort of in a one-on-one showdown with a rival who has similar armaments that are also really big and really effective. In that situation, it doesn't pay either side to escalate into battle because we both know we'll lose. That mutually assured destruction phenomenon is real, and it can lead to a stalemate and it can lead to peace. But it requires the biggest, most deadly weapons also being so astonishingly expensive that only the superpowers can afford them. That's the reason there's only two facing it. They're the only states out there that can afford to play that game. And that's what keeps it simple, and that's what keeps it predictable. The things that we're facing now aren't like that, because the weapons of mass destruction that were those state-of-the-art, astronomically expensive weapons during the Cold War aren't now. There's tons of nuclear weapons out there that are rotting away in storage sheds, that are, and we have biological weapons now that are really dangerous that you can build for a couple grand in a basement. And so the weapons with the most killing power aren't the most expensive now. Lots and lots of organizations.
Let me interject one that I think, just to play devil's advocate for a second.
That makes it very scary because now it's a one-on-one showdown. It's not predictable.
But here's
shouldn't work.
Here's an interesting one that I think if we put ourselves in the shoes of the average Ukrainian today. So I believe in the early 90s, Ukraine had the third biggest stockpile of nukes, right? And so the USSR breaks up. They've got the third biggest stockpile. And the deal essentially was, okay, give up all your nukes. Basically NATO will protect you, or we won't let anything happen. And so Ukraine gives up their trump card, so to speak, and then boom. I mean, I can't think there's any state actor right now that will ever believe, after watching what happened in Ukraine, they will never believe on a state actor at that level that a nuke is not a deterrent. They won't believe it.
But how is a deterrent when too many players on the stage start having these things? I mean, again, if we're going to take lessons from animals, deterrence only works in very specific situations. And they're ones where the outcomes are very predictable. And that predictability comes from these sort of one-on-one showdown matchups. And in a landscape where a dozen or 24 nations have weapons of mass destruction of one sort or another, deterrence shouldn't work in that kind of situation.
Okay, but if we put ourselves in the leadership of Ukraine and they give up their nukes and they're told they're going to have protection, nobody's going to ever believe, no state is ever going to believe, if I give up my nukes. And of course, I mean, look, it's insane. The whole thing's insane.
This is the problem. So any state looking at itself, which is what states have to do, is going to come to the inescapable conclusion that they're going to be safer with these types of weapons of mass destruction than without. For the logic that you're referring to, nobody's going to screw with us because the consequences are too dire.
Yeah.
Fine. But when you get too many states that make that independent assessment and that then ratchet up to that level, the collective effect on the global landscape is pandemonium. I mean, it's unpredictable. It's not a one-on-one showdown the way we had in the Cold War. It's a much more complex,
it's something different
thing, and that's where I am so out of my element. I'm a biologist again. I mean, let's not forget, I work on beetles. But that's where the logic that made so much sense, that brought so much clarity to understanding our past by looking at animals, that logic begins to dissolve. And I ended up no longer being comfortable making predictions about where we are today, because the landscape that we're sitting on today literally scared the daylights out of me. I mean, if I'm going to draw conclusions from the animals, the conclusion is, wow, this is a spectacularly dangerous situation that we're in. Partly because it's a more complicated landscape without that predictability of a one-on-one showdown, and partly because the technologies, the legacy of the Cold War, like it or not, are weapons with a capacity to kill on a scale that's unprecedented. There are no animals with weapons of mass destruction like that. There are no animal parallels of a weapon that is so dangerous it can't really ever be used anywhere. I mean, we just don't have examples of that in the animal world. And so once you raise the stakes that high, you're getting to a point where these weapons are so dangerous, they really can't be used ever, anywhere. And there is no precedent. I mean, again, I mentioned things like fiddler crab claws and caribou antlers. These make great deterrents. And in the caribou 11,000 contests, only 6 escalated to full battle. But you know what? 6 of them did escalate to full battle. These things still do function as weapons occasionally. And we're talking about technologies that we've inherited now that are so bad that we can't let that ever happen. And there is no precedent for that in nature. It never happens in nature. They always get used at some point. And that's, I guess, where I start getting the chills up my spine, start getting scared.
It's funny. I don't necessarily get the chills. No, but not because I don't think it will happen. I think the chances are, maybe not in our lifetime, but the chances are at some point in time, if too many state actors have nukes and some of those state actors are not as well funded or this or that, something's going to happen. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, if somebody could do 9/11, they can. I mean, look, if they had a suitcase nuke on 9/11 and they had it in New York City, they would have used it. They would have used it. Of course they would have used it. Why not? That's the way they were thinking.
You're not helping me feel better here.
How can I?
So where are you going with this? You're right. You're exactly right. This is why I'm scared. Because if you take something like that, to put that into context, that's a sneak strategy. We talk about sneaky male beetles getting in around the big fighting male. With a superpower like the United States, with the conventional arsenals that we have, the options that are on the table for most of our opponents are the little sneaky male strategies. They break the rules. They do something unexpected and unorthodox, and they don't fight us fair fights on a level playing field. And when you start taking sneaky strategies like that, they happen in every animal system out there. They've all got sneaky males of some kind or another. That makes perfect sense. But it doesn't really affect the integrity or the profitability, if you will, of the armaments of the big males, because it still pays to be the biggest male most of the time. But if the sneaky males start doing too well, if they start stealing too many of the matings, then you run into this point where all of a sudden these big guys are producing these big expensive weapons and they're shunting tons of resources into it. And then instead of getting a return on their investment, their return is being eroded by these sneaky parasitic guys that are sneaking in and breaking the rules and cheating and pulling away all the benefits. And so they're not paying the cost. So these big guys are paying this cost and they're no longer getting the benefits. You reach this point where an arms race can collapse because it's just not worth it anymore, because the sneaking strategies do too well. So most of the time, the little sneaky strategies they're not that effective. Yeah, they can do harm, but they're not going to completely topple the regime or win in an outright sort of black and white sense of the word. They're just there being a hassle. But if you start getting sneaky strategies with weapons of mass destruction, if you're talking a suitcase bomber with a suitcase nuke, now you're changing the stakes here. You're talking about sneaky strategies with the potential to inflict catastrophic damage. And again, there is no in the animal world, that would collapse an arms race. Is done. It's like it's not worth having big weapons anymore because they're not going to help you anymore. But I don't know that you can make that parallel and extend that logic.
I would start doing yoga and meditation, because it's not worth worrying about something that will surely happen at some point in time.
But I will tell you that as an evolutionary biologist, it's been a pretty wild ride. It's fun starting to look at the landscape around us today. And I like history, starting to look at the past and thinking about it in this new light.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's awesome.
I want to end on a high note. That's an intellectually rewarding and stimulating exercise. It's a great way to sort of improve our understanding of the natural world. I live in Montana. I've got elk behind my house, and we've got, I live surrounded by animals with crazy weapons. And a lot of that diversity makes more sense now. And I love history. And so reading the history, a lot of the arms races in the past make more sense now. So the parallels are really rewarding. It's just awesome. When we start getting to where we are today, that we're dealing with a landscape that has no precedent, where things start getting both scary and really unpredictable.
I'll give you a high note change of subject. So I was jotting a last note down here about my world, and I was thinking to myself, okay, there's no guarantee that all the expensive resources that can give you perhaps a predictable, short-term, high-frequency trading advantage. There's no guarantee that all that stuff's going to work, but less money spent and that nimbleness sounds a heck of a lot more interesting to me. I love nimble. Nimble should be the topic of our conversation. I mean, I just love nimble. The idea of being nimble, I'd rather be a nimble character as a human being in this world right now than stuck. Now, I'm just talking from myself standpoint.
No, it's so funny. I mean, I study all these animals with these monstrous weapons, and we all like to identify with the biggest bucks with the biggest racks of antlers on their heads. But, most of us don't fit that bill. And I'm probably more of the sneaky male strategy myself, I suppose. Nimble is good. I'll agree with you.
Hey, listen, Doug, it's been fun chatting. Where can we send people? The book is on Amazon. I know because I just bought it. The book is on Amazon.
It's also through Henry Holt and Macmillan. They have a page. It's called Animal Weapons, The Evolution of Battle.
Where can people find out more about you online? You've got a bunch of stuff online. You've got a lab online, all kinds of stuff.
I'm a biology professor at the University of Montana, so I have a research page and a faculty page that's really easy to find. I don't know if we have a Wikipedia page yet, but we may have one soon. But again, the other way to find me is just to search for Animal Weapons, The Evolution of Battle, and there's an author page and there's information there. Now, this has been a pleasure. Thank you for chatting.
Thanks for it's one of my most unique podcasts yet, I'm sure. Thanks,
I hadn't
Doug.
seen the parallels with trading until you brought it up, but I think there's a pretty cool parallel there.
Yeah,
I had never thought of before. So thank you for that.
Hey, take care, man. We'll talk again, hopefully in the future.
All right, you too. Take care.
Now for my second guest today, Philip Tetlock. In preparing to talk to you today, I was thinking back to my days in grad school, and specifically the fall of 1992, and even a little bit before that. And I was thinking to the political season at the time, and this was essentially the rise of Bill Clinton. And what's really interesting about the rise of Bill Clinton, and I think you probably have even more experience and more memory and probably were studying it more than me at the time, but I watched a lot of CNN and I thought it was so amazing as a political science major myself at the time in grad school. I was like, wow, all of the main players didn't run against then President Bush because his approval rating was so high. I mean, guys like Dick Gephardt, Bill Bradley, they were all like, we don't want anything to do with this. And so in that vacuum walked an unknown governor from Arkansas who frankly was probably just trying to boost his political resume. And for that particular run, probably really had no thought of, winning necessarily. But then a funny little thing happened. And what's really interesting about forecasting and prediction, how in the world could that have been predicted? That have been forecasted? Or could it have?
Well, absolutely. It's so difficult to reconstruct our past states of ignorance. In the Super Forecasting book, we talk about that Saturday Night Live episode in which the leading lights of the Democratic Party in 1991 bend over backwards to avoid the risk of being nominated to run against the invincible President George Herbert Walker Bush.
You backfill time and you look back over time and it kind of looks like, well, this was all just expected to happen, but it could have unfolded in a completely different manner. But that kind of leads me into the kind of opening you up to your expertise in this forecasting and prediction, which is something that most people just accept. We accept, okay, here's a prediction, here's a forecast, but there's usually not much follow through. We don't really ever check to see what's happening. And there's all these experts that get paid all this money. But you, and I'm going to break this apart over the course of our time today, but you have figured out through a lot of research and a lot of study, a lot of surveying, a lot of working with people, that regular folks can beat the experts at their own game.
Essentially, that's right. I mean, the very best forecasters are talented people. I don't want to downplay their credentials, but it is remarkable that the group of citizens we were able to recruit for the forecasting tournament sponsored by the U.S. intelligence community were able to beat U.S. intelligence analysts at their own game.
Talk about that, though. I mean, that's quite amazing. I mean, we're talking about often some of these large government programs, they have billions and billions in assets. I mean, huge numbers of people. I mean, why don't you start from kind of the beginning of your process and how you were able to get to the point where regular people could compete with or defeat people with unlimited funding?
Well, this is a research project that never should have occurred if the most basic laws of bureaucracy had held. Bureaucracy 101 tells aspiring bureaucrats never sponsor something that has the potential to be embarrassing and come back and bite you in the butt. The IARPA, the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity, the research and development branch of the Office of Director of National Intelligence, which presides over that $50 billion bureaucracy, IARPA, this upstart agency, had the temerity to do that. It was as if Goliath took David aside and said, here's some money, try to develop a good slingshot.
Was there a side of you that already knew that there was going to be some indication that your work was going to present results they might not like?
It was a very formal competition. IARPA launched it in 2010. A lot of universities and consulting firms competed for the money. My wife and I, Barb Mellers, my collaborator, and I were still at Berkeley at the time. We put together a proposal that was a joint Berkeley-Penn proposal because we moved to the University of Pennsylvania at the end of 2010. But we were in competition with major research universities and consulting operations for various reasons. The coalition of researchers we put together, which we called the Good Judgment Project, was successful in recruiting very good forecasters, was successful in developing methods of training them, was successful in developing methods of teaming them, was successful in developing algorithms that distilled wisdom from the crowd, and the net result was the Good Judgment Project prevailed in the competition. It won so decisively in the first 2 years that essentially IARPA terminated the other teams, let us poach the best talent, and put us in direct competition with a prediction market and internal benchmarks they had.
Before this conversation, I was thinking, not knowing exactly, okay, frankly, as you mentioned, a bureaucracy funding you, and they might not like the results they get. But there's probably other people outside of the Defense Department who sponsor this. There's probably other people, I can imagine, in this world who have made their life's work, their life's blood, the money they make off predictions that are not checked. Your work can't be a good feeling, because I have a feeling in the long run, whatever that long run might be, your type of work is going to be something that's going to cause a lot of people that are just used to saying whatever with no one checking them. That's going to go away in some point in the future, I would think.
I think it's going to be a long-term change. Culture change tends to happen very slowly, and we're talking about changing some very basic practices in the political world. I think we're going to see more and more in advanced tech companies and advanced sectors in the most sophisticated government agencies. We're going to see more and more quantification of uncertainty. Even it's going to extend beyond domains where we already do it with big data into domains that were previously thought to be the exclusive preserve of soft subjective human judgment. And soft subjective human judgment will increasingly be pressured to be more explicit and to demonstrate its value added. It's just not enough to say, if you're a pundit. Someday I think you're right. I think at some point it will be the case that pundits who talk about things being a distinct possibility, or this could happen or might happen or may happen, people will look at that and they'll say, you're essentially saying nothing.
I've liked a lot of his books, The Lexus and the Olive Tree and whatnot, but you get on Tom Friedman pretty good. And look, there's plenty of pundits that you could get on. I think people don't necessarily, and this also comes to the public too, is like, we don't demand accuracy. We don't demand data as a whole, as a population, do we? And what is the reason for that we don't put the demand on these pundits for accuracy?
So incidentally, I have enjoyed Tom Friedman's books as well, and we didn't single out Tom Friedman because he thought he was a particularly egregious offender. I think he's very representative of the genre.
Let me go to an example that I think a lot of people can relate to. So the Iraq War in 2003, the WMD issue. And I always, when people will talk about this, and usually it's a highly partisan thing, and I say what's really interesting about it to me is, even if you don't remember all the details, if you had George Bush and Hillary Clinton on the same side of the fence, that at least tells me that behind the scenes, the intelligence agencies were delivering something that let two very partisan groups, Bush and Clinton, believe the same result. Why don't you talk about some of the lessons learned there and what was the real lesson there? Because clearly both sides of the fence, except for people like perhaps Barack Obama and Bernie Sanders, both sides of the fence believe that those WMDs were there. And I would love for you to also to break apart some of the notion that they should have been more probabilistic in their estimates for the public, but they were very certain they were there. And that was another issue you address in your work.
Well, I think the Iraq WMD case is a very important one because I don't think the research project, the tournaments even would have happened had the intelligence community not made so massive an error on WMD. When this director of the Central Intelligence Agency tells the President of the United States and other principals that he thinks it's a slam dunk, their weapons of mass destruction, or at least he thinks it's a slam dunk. He can convince people they're weapons of mass destruction. Whatever exactly he said slam dunk. When the most senior officials in the intelligence community use terminology like that in a situation where there is at least some degree of ambiguity, that's telling. Now, you're right. When you look back at the information available to key policymakers and intelligence agencies around the world, the preponderance of opinion was that Saddam was up to something, that he had some kind of, he was violating the UN
sanctions.
He was violating those, and that nobody knew exactly what he had, obviously. There was no smoking gun, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. Saddam behaved in ways to encourage the impression that he had something, perhaps because he didn't want to appear to be weak. So Saddam was actually facilitating the hardliners, making it easier for the hardliners who ultimately destroyed him, which is another ironic subtext to all this. It's really hard to know what the true what probability would a perfect information processor have assigned to Saddam having weapons of mass destruction in Iraq before the invasion. We know it's not 1.0, but we also know it's not 0. We know it's somewhere in between. And we know that even the intelligence agencies of countries that did not want to invade Iraq thought that there was a good chance he had something. Now, I think if you were to construct some kind of weighted average of all the sophisticated observers and their perspectives on Iraqi WMD, you would find that the probability of Iraq having something, the estimated probability, given the information they had then, would have been higher than 50% and certainly less than 100%. So it's somewhere in between. Let's say it was 70 or 75%. Would the U.S. Congress have voted to approve the use of force if they had thought the probability was as low as 75% as opposed to a slam dunk? I think there's a good possibility they would not have. And I think the world history would have unfolded quite differently.
Based on what you know, how is an error, because clearly it was an error to come out and say it was a slam dunk, how did the experts get into a position to tell me as much as you can or what you do know to make such a statement instead of coming out with is that where the politics took over, that instead of coming out with the probabilistic estimate, they came out with the slam dunk? Is that what happened? Was that the partisan or the politics getting involved?
I think it's very difficult to reconstruct. And I think Robert Jervis at Columbia University has written a very interesting post-mortem of the WMD intelligence analysis. I think part of the problem was that this was happening in the aftermath of 9/11, and nobody wanted to make a false negative mistake. Nobody wanted to make the mistake of saying Saddam has nothing, and then he turns out to have something. Within 2 years of having failed to warn adequately against the risk of Al-Qaeda's attacks on 9/11. Two big false negative errors right in a row would be very politically damaging. If you're going to make an error in the blame game culture of Washington, D.C., make sure it's not the same type of error you made last time.
Let me continue to break this apart with you. Your work is quite dense. I highly recommend people to take a look at super forecasting for sure. But let's say the talking heads out there, I'm getting beyond even the intelligence issues in Iraq, but the talking heads out there, they're smart people. They present themselves well, but they don't put these probabilistic weights on their predictions. And this could be a CNBC person talking the market. This could be a geopolitical type person on Bloomberg. But even if they did, if you came out and you said,
hey, I've got a chance of only being 60% right. Well, that means that person could be 40% wrong. If we start to get closer to this probabilistic way of thinking in public discourse, where does that leave us? I mean, we have to, as a society, dealing with uncertainty becomes a real educational process, doesn't it?
It sure does. That's absolutely right. So I'm going to retreat into a little bit of academic talk for a second, and then
Go for it.
I'll try to make it as plain as I can. The accuracy of probability estimates of single events is inherently indeterminate, as long as the forecaster is not so foolish as to say 0 and the event happens, or 1.0 and the event does not happen. Otherwise, the forecaster can always argue that something unlikely happened when the forecaster appears to be on the wrong side of maybe. This means we're going to have to start thinking about forecasting and judgment in a different sort of way. We're going to have to think about it the way we think about sports. We have to get at least as sophisticated about this as we are in thinking about, say, the batting averages of players in Major League Baseball, or the free throw percentages of basketball players, and so forth. It's a probabilistic game. You don't draw the inference that a forecaster is bad simply because the forecaster was on the wrong side of maybe on a particular call. It's really tempting to do that. We talk in the book about how one of the most sophisticated journalists in the United States, David Leonhardt, who created the upshot of the New York Times, how David Leonhardt, after the Supreme Court narrowly upheld Obamacare in 2011, David Leonhardt wrote that the prediction markets had been predicting that there was a 75% probability the Supreme Court would overturn the law. And he said quite categorically the prediction markets got it wrong. Those smart aleck economists aren't as smart as they think they are. Markets aren't as perfect as they think they are. Now, as you've already alluded to, when the markets say a 75% chance, that means there's a 25% chance it's not going to happen. How much confidence should you lose in those prediction markets when you learn that they put a 75% chance on something that didn't happen? Should you throw them out altogether and say, these guys are clueless, I'm not going to pay attention to them anymore? Or should you say something along the following lines? Should you say, well, these prediction markets have made hundreds of predictions on hundreds of topics over several years, and we know that on average, when they say 75% likelihood, things do happen about 75% of the time. So this market appears to be pretty well calibrated. Now, is it good news for the credibility of the market that they're on the wrong side of maybe on this call? No. You should lose a little bit of confidence in them, but how much should you lose? Let's say you thought there was a 90% chance markets were really great beforehand, and now you learn that they're on the wrong side of maybe on the Supreme Court call. How much should you move downward from 90%? Maybe 88, 89? You certainly shouldn't go down to 0.
Yeah, for sure. Let me add to where you're going there as well. And you bring up sports, and I can think of something like, okay, you start to look at the use of probability statistics in sports, and the book and the film are quite famous now. Moneyball, I always end up watching it. I can't turn it off when it comes on, and I was a baseball guy. And I can look at Wall Street too. And what's really interesting when I start to think about Wall Street is that so many on Wall Street, since they're playing a game that never stops, it really isn't about necessarily your winning percentage or your losing percentage. It's, do you have a positive mathematical edge that you can bet on? And so that takes it even a step further than just looking at percent accuracy, because percent accuracy, frankly, I mean, maybe it's great for the weather, but for serious parts of life, it really starts to open the question of betting. And if you can find a positive mathematical expectation, doesn't it?
For sure. I mean, it's very easy to convince people in finance that there's an advantage in becoming more accurate, better calibrated, more granular in your assessments of uncertainty. We talked with Aaron Brown, the chief risk officer of AQR, a big hedge fund. Aaron also happens to be a really serious poker player, and he made the observation that you can tell the difference between a world-class poker player and a talented amateur, because the world-class players are better at distinguishing 60-40 bets from 40-60 bets.
I saw her mentioned in your book, but I've had Annie Duke on my podcast, and it was one of the most popular podcasts for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So good poker players know this. They know it in their bones that it helps to be granular. Maybe 60-40, 40-60 isn't good enough anymore. Maybe it has to be 55-45, 45-55, or 52-48, 48-52. But it pays to be granular. So in finance, it's a pretty easy sell because, there are options, and you can back out of options quite readily the probabilities, the implied probabilities that oil is going to go above or below some threshold price because you're buying an option to purchase things at a designated price. There, it's an easier sell. It's a harder sell, I think, in national security to convince people that, let's say you're the President of the United States and the Sochi Olympics are on in 2014, someone comes up to you and says, Mr. President, our previous estimate of a Russian incursion into Ukraine was 1%. It's just spiked up to 20%. You want to do something? What do you want to do about it? Now, maybe the president would have done something about it, and history would have unfolded differently in various ways. But it's telling that it's harder in many domains of life to translate improved probability into improved decisions. It's less obvious than it is in finance or in sports gambling and certain other quantitative areas.
Yeah, I think when you have the motivation of making money, it's quite different than if you're a president and you have to make a call based on a probability estimate, and that call could affect potentially millions of lives. That's a completely different ballgame than just making the proper bet with a certain weighting, a certain probability weighting, trying to make money. Those are different ballgames.
They're different ballgames, but I don't know if they're completely different ballgames. I think in both cases, the decision maker has to grapple with uncertainty, has to make implicit or explicit probability judgments that are going to influence his or her decisions. So there is a deep structural similarity there.
I'm going to jump around on you because you've covered a lot of territory in your work, and it's fascinating to me. And I love there's so many. I could sit here and go line by line and literally pick apart the entire book and have you talk. But you bring up an interesting example with a gentleman named Robert Rubin, who started. He was at Goldman Sachs. He worked under Clinton. A great probabilistic thinker, and everyone loved him and thought he's fantastic job in the late 90s, right? And then, the 2008 crash comes and he's the worst thing since he's just a terrible, terrible guy. I really don't have the experience to speak to that one way or the other. But talk about the Rubin example and those extremes. And he was always just a probability guy.
He was, and probability guys aren't always right. Just as the prediction markets weren't quote unquote right about Obamacare. But they tend to be pretty well calibrated, which means that if you knew nothing else, you would be wise to listen quite carefully to what they have to say.
Yeah. I want to try and dig a little bit into your super forecasters and some of the lessons learned and some of the ideas that maybe will translate or pass along to people listening, or at least they'll get inspired to go take a look at your work. The 2008 crisis was really interesting because, so many people, you can look at comments in 2005, 6, 7, even early 08, people are like, there's no problem with real estate, stock market's great, this and that. But, a funny thing happened, that stock market, when the S&P started to tick down over the course of 2008, that price action itself seemed to be a heuristic for something. So, you don't necessarily know what's going to happen, but I guess where I'm going to let you go with is when you start to train your super forecasters, and I'm just kind of outlining the S&P moving down over the course of 2008, but the super forecasters are looking for, one of the things they're looking for are sources of aggregated data, and using those available sources of aggregated data. If that's betting on sports, that's looking at Las Vegas odds, going to the various sports books. But I'm thinking aggregated data is also the price action in markets. Why don't you talk about aggregated data as one aspect of the traits and trainings that go into the super forecasting?
That's right. The super forecasters are acutely aware that there is very valuable information lying around in the world that's been pre-processed for them, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel when they approach many problems. Now, the stock market is far from a reliable indicator to whether there's going to be a major economic recession. Paul Samuelson famously joked that it's predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions. But that doesn't mean the stock market is a zero predictor. The stock market has some predictive power there. Super forecasters are acutely aware of the wisdom of the crowd literature. They're also aware of the potential madness of the crowd. They approach these things somewhat warily, but if they knew nothing else but a good wisdom of the crowd indicator as reflected in London bookie odds or the latest prediction market results, if they knew nothing else but that, they would probably want that to be their starting prediction.
You know, as we dig apart this, I want to read just a brief excerpt from your work. And it said, researchers have found that merely asking people to assume their initial judgment is wrong, to seriously consider why that might be, and then make another judgment produces a second estimate, which, when combined with the first, improves accuracy almost as much as getting a second estimate from another person. So it's almost like getting a second opinion from yourself, but the combination of the two makes you more accurate. It just isn't intuitive, is it?
It's not very intuitive, but I think it is intuitive to people that we talk to ourselves. We're talking to ourselves all the time. So we know that there are quite often conflicting opinions in our own heads. Not as strange as it sounds to ask somebody to offer two separate estimates.
Yeah, and another aspect that you talk about in your work, and I believe this starts with Daniel Kahneman, who I know you're quite fond of. Educate the audience, just for people that have never heard of this topic, educate them to the idea of the inside-outside distinction and how that plays into the super forecasting technique and training.
That's one of the bigger advantages that super forecasters had over regular forecasters. It was their tendency to start with the outside view and work into the inside slowly, rather than what regular forecasters would do, would start with the inside view and rarely consider the outside view. In the forecasting tournament, our forecasters were asked an extraordinarily diverse range of questions. They were asked about Sino-Japanese clashes in the East China Sea. They were asked about Russia and the Ukraine, Greece leaving the Eurozone, Ebola, Arctic sea ice, all over the place. So no forecaster, super or regular, is going to be an expert, quote unquote, on anything more than a very tiny fraction of the questions posed because they're so heterogeneous. This is putting a premium on mental agility and being a quick study. Let's say, for sake of argument, you're in the tournament and someone asks you a question about whether a particular African dictator is likely to remain in power for another year. And you can barely spot the country on a map, less still say anything intelligent about who the dictator is. So you know almost nothing as your starting position for the forecasting problem. If you're a super forecaster, even though you know almost nothing, you don't know nothing. You know something. They're able to extract information very quickly. And there is a kernel to that question. And it is, the dictators tend to be sticky. Once a dictator has been in power for a certain period, the likelihood of that dictator making it another year is extremely high. It's probably as high as 0.95. That doesn't mean you're going to say, oh, there's a 0.95 likelihood of this particular dictator remaining in power. But it does mean that your initial estimate is going to be that there's a high probability of dictator survival. And you're going to adjust from that in response to new evidence about the particulars, the inside view of that situation. So if you discover on the inside view that this dictator is 91 years old and has advanced prostate cancer, you're going to say, I'm going to downplay it. And if you discover there's intense fighting in the suburbs of the capital between rival military units, again, you're going to adjust. But you're going to start with a reasonable base rate judgment, and then you're going to adjust in response to the particulars. Most people just jump into the particulars right away, and that can cause some. That is not a good idea if you want to get a really good Breyer score, which is the accuracy measure we used.
I think that raises an issue here where so many of us get fixated on the why, but it's more about the how. I mean, the super forecasters are more about the how. This is very, very data driven, and it's breaking things up into their pieces. And talk about the issue where so many of us get fixated on the why and how that's to our detriment when it comes to any type of forecasting or prediction.
Well, that's right. And it's really interesting that there seem to have been more software engineers who are super forecasters than political scientists.
Well, yeah, I mean, these are guys that are used to, bits and bytes, 0, 1. Let's code it. Let's test it out. Let's see what's going on. And, I guess I mentioned a political science degree in myself. I mean, hopefully I can, I've learned to put all those opinions aside to some degree and look more at the data. But yeah,
I think most of humanity probably sides more with the feeling that we're all political science majors and we've all got an opinion, but it doesn't work out that way, does it?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. But this distinction between how and why thinking is a very important one. We talked about how super forecasters are less likely, for example, to believe in fate than regular forecasters or most citizens are. What does that mean? Well, there's an interesting body of psychological work that suggests that when you remind people of all the fluky circumstances that led them to make an important decision in their lives, how they came to be married to a particular person or wind up living in a particular city or doing a particular job, when you highlight all of the low probability events surrounding those outcomes, net effect of doing that for most people is to persuade people that the event in question had to be, that it was meant to be. That's even true for lottery winners, for example. When they win, they don't think it was just a fluke. They often infuse it with some deeper metaphysical significance, that it was somehow meant to be. Super forecasters don't think that way. They think, well, things happen. Someone had to win. Something very improbable just happened. Improbable things do sometimes happen. It would be very unlikely if unlikely things never happened. It would violate the laws of probability. So super forecasters are that way. It's a rather unromantic worldview. It means that the super forecaster might have to look at his or her spouse and say, well, I guess I could have wound up with any one of 433,000 other spouses. But we wound up together, and let's make the best of it.
Well, and that's what's interesting about your work is that you're not attempting to tell people, hey, this is about meaning or this is about happiness. You're saying, here's what happened. Here's the data. Here's how regular people can start to forecast and predict social phenomena with greater accuracy than you might expect, and greater accuracy than perhaps extremely well-paid experts. But again, you're not attempting to tell people this is the way the world is and you should feel this way and feel that way. You're just kind of saying, here's the data, take it or leave it. Am I reading you right?
That's exactly right. These are the data. If you want to enjoy the benefits of thinking more probabilistically, the book lays out how you can go about doing that. If you prefer to think in terms of fate, then you may have less use for a book of this sort.
Now, we're not going to go there today because that's a whole different subject area, and I can think of a lot of people out there that would probably really look. I've seen the people that love your book, but I can think of some people out there, guys like Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett. I mean, there's a lot of people that would probably relate to this. Let me go on a sidetrack for a second. You're good enough in your work to go ahead and outline some. These are people that you respect, that you've worked with, where they might have some criticism of the notion of super forecasting. And I would love for you to kind of outline just briefly if Daniel Kahneman is considered a slight critic or Nassim Taleb is considered a slight critic, even though, like I said, you've worked closely with both men. I know you respect them both. Talk about their criticisms of the idea of super forecasting.
Well, I think these are matters of degree more than matters of kind. I think Nassim Taleb puts more emphasis on the radical unpredictability of high-impact events like so-called black swans. I think we agree that extremely high-impact, low-probability events can have a huge impact on history, that this is manifestly true. We prefer to think of there being a continuum from white swans to gray swans to dark gray swans to black swans. We think it's useful to ask how good can early warning and early opportunity indicators be for swans of varying degrees of grayness. It's not a dichotomy between white and black swans. So I think we see greater value in investing energy in improving the accuracy of probability judgments, whereas I think Nassim Taleb in his most recent book on anti-fragility sees greater value in investing in contingency plans to cope with black swans. It's just a different emphases. I don't see how you can make contingency plans without also attaching probabilities to scenarios. So I don't think there's any avoiding probabilities. I think you can try to cover them up, but I don't think it's wise to try to do that. So there is a difference of opinion there. I think the differences with Danny are even slighter. They have to do with the degree to which he is less optimistic than we are about the feasibility of finding better forecasters who will be consistently better, of training them to be consistently better, of teaming them, of finding algorithms that prove to be consistently better. So I don't think he denies that there's some potential for improvement. I think he's probably a little more pessimistic than we are about the magnitude of the potential, but these are subtle differences, and I think each of us is willing to move in response to evidence. I think we are inevitably going to run into low predictability years in which the very best forecasters are hard-pressed to do any better than dart-throwing chimpanzees.
Talk about the words prediction and forecasting, because I think people really do, from a very, big picture look down, 35,000 feet flying, prediction this isn't certainty. Forecasting is not certainty. This is and this is getting back to the whole theme of this conversation is really staying in or getting into, for the first time, a probabilistic mindset.
It is hard. Imagine you're talking to a super forecaster in a bar, and conversation turns to global warming, and someone turns to the super forecaster and says, "Hey, do you believe in global warming?" I think your typical super forecaster would look at that as a stupid question. Just pretty stupid. Why is it a stupid question? Well, there are two major reasons it's a stupid question. First, global warming is ill-defined. What in goodness name does it mean? Does he expect the temperature of the Earth to be 3.6 degrees centigrade warmer in 2100 than it was, say, in the average of the 20th century? What exactly is the threshold for global warming? Is it 2 degrees centigrade, 1 degree? What are the bands? That would be the first. Super forecasters don't like vague verbiage, and they don't like vague verbiage when it comes to the outcomes of forecasts. They also don't like vague verbiage when it comes to things like this, using distinct possibility as opposed to numbers. And they don't like saying, "Do you believe?" as though your beliefs are something like a light switch that can go off and on, 0 or 1, because they distinguish many degrees of uncertainty. So the right way to ask the question for a super forecaster would be, to what degree do you believe that the temperature, the average surface temperature of the Earth in 2100 will fall into the following temperature band differentials?
Yeah, and that's not sexy.
That's not exactly casual barroom conversation. It's not exactly the thing that even political ideologues can get all heated up about. It becomes a pretty technical matter of, let's sit down at the table here and try to calculate and go through the time series and go through the causal models and go to the climate models and look at how accurate they have been, look at what the critiques are, and reach a reasoned judgment about what the likelihoods are. Now, you're not going to mobilize the political will you need to do something about climate change if people are saying, well, I think the probability based on the 2015 temperature spike has moved from 0.86 to 0.88 of the temperature in 2100 being 1.3 degrees centigrade or higher. You see what I'm saying? It's people's eyes start to glaze over. All the fun of politics seems to be drained out. All the opportunities to denounce the other side for being stupid or gullible or rigid or, all the fun stuff in political psychology.
The math can start to get a little more advanced, but the process in simple form is, and I'm kind of quoting here, try, fail, analyze, adjust, try again. I mean, this is kind of how we all learn as kids, but something happens to us maybe when we become adults. We forget this whole skepticism and trying to have some scientific principles to our lives.
Right, and that's because a lot of these questions, when say, do you believe in climate change, or do you support X or Y or Z, they're not really asking you for a considered probabilistic judgment about the consequences of going down one policy path or another. They're asking you, what political tribe do you belong to? Are you one of us? Or are you one of them?
Yep, for sure.
And that's a game that super forecasters tend not to play. And it is interesting that it's actually the super forecasters, when I look at their backgrounds, they're quite heterogeneous. I mean, they're diverse, but there is overrepresentation among people who are accustomed to thinking about very complex problems in ways that decompose them into tractable components, like software people, financial analysts, and some political risk analysts as well.
Let me ask one last question since I've got you here. I think Daniel Kahneman asked you this question, I believe, if I'm remembering right. But do you see the super forecasters as different kinds of people or as people who do different kinds of things, which is ultimately this nature versus nurture question?
Danny Kahneman has a wonderful way of posing succinct and incisive questions. That is one of the key questions. It's both. It's not true that anyone could be a super forecaster. There are certain cognitive and motivational prerequisites for becoming a super forecaster. A surprising number of people could improve their probability estimation skills quite a bit if they followed the guidelines in the book. So there is a lot of room for improvement for a lot of people. Certainly many people who are not currently super forecasters could become super forecasters if they were so inclined. Here's the core of it. I'm sometimes asked, how could these amateurs have beaten intelligence analysts? I don't think it's because the amateurs were more intelligent than intelligence analysts, and I certainly don't think it's because they had more political knowledge than the intelligence analysts. I think it's because the super forecasters believe that probability estimation of messy real-world events is a skill that can be cultivated and is worth cultivating. And they took a shot at it. They invested effort. It doesn't matter how high your IQ is or how much political knowledge you have or how exalted a status you have as a political pundit. If you're not going to take seriously the challenges of probability estimation, you're never going to get better at it. You don't learn to distinguish 60-40 bets from 40-60 bets by using vague verbiage forecasting like, I think there's a distinct possibility of X. The only way you learn is by making your judgments explicit, getting feedback, and learning.
Did you ever think 30 years ago that you would be on such the front line of an interesting kind of like real, probabilistic thinking is not necessarily new, but you are right there at the front line of getting people to look at it in a different way with some really great examples. It's quite fun, huh?
It's fun. I started the work before Gorbachev became general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and the experts then weren't able to predict that, but everybody could explain it after the fact. It doesn't seem to matter how high the stakes are. The thinking is equally sloppy and tendentious and self-serving. So I see this as an important part of human progress, of moving the Enlightenment agenda forward. I think political debate, we conduct political debates remarkably primitively. I think when people look back on how primitively we conducted political debates 400 years from now, they won't judge us any more charitably than we judge the people who ran the Salem witch trials.
I think that's a great place to end it. I think that's gets people thinking. The book is Super Forecasting, the Art and Science of Prediction. It is everywhere. Is there a website we can send people to, Phil?
I think people might enjoy, if they find the concepts interesting, they might enjoy visiting superforecasting.com, which is a blog that's run by some super forecasters. I also am now on Twitter, believe it or not. I've never done that before, and I'm enjoying it. So I would welcome people to track what's going on there.
Thank you for taking the time today, sir. I appreciate it.
Okay, take care.
And finally, last but not least, Ken Blanchard.
Ken, let me jump right in and go back in time a little bit. I imagine into the early 80s, you released your book, The 1 Minute Manager. But before that, talk to me about an event or a time period in your life, perhaps as a teenager, an experience with family, something that when that book came out and it became a hit, that you knew that some of those early experiences, perhaps an early experience in your teen years, really helped set that foundation. Because I think it'd be fascinating for people to see, for someone who's had such a noted career as you, where was the start? Because it just doesn't happen. There's a lot of building and iterations and steps on top of steps. Where did it all start for you?
Well, it was interesting. I had an amazing father who retired as an admiral in the Navy. He was my leadership coach. I had an interesting upbringing. I went to a 95% Jewish elementary school, and on Jewish holidays they put us all in one room, and then we merged in junior high school with a 95% African American elementary school, which went to the Supreme Court in '61 to test the neighborhood school, and I kind of won all the elections as a compromise candidate, and I won the president of the 7th grade, and I was all pumped up, and I came home. It was my first entry into junior high school, and I told my dad, he said, "Congratulations, Ken, but now that you're president, don't ever use your position." He said, "Great leaders are great because people trust and respect them, not because they have power." That was the beginning of my leadership training with him, and so it was really interesting. And so the 1 Minute Manager was really kind of one of those God things, because Margie and I met Spencer Johnson at a cocktail party, and he wrote children's books. He wrote a whole series called Value Tales, the value of honesty, the story of Abe Lincoln, the value of determination, the story of Helen Keller, and the value of sense of humor, the story of Will Rogers. And Margie met him first and hand carried him over to me and said, "You guys ought to write a children's book for managers. They won't read anything else." So he was working on a 1-minute scolding on how to discipline kids, and I invited him to a seminar, and he got all excited and laughed and came running up at the end and said, "Forget parenting, let's do the 1-minute manager." And since he was a children's book writer, and I was a storyteller because my father taught me how to speak, he said, when you work with a group, you need to make a point, tell a story. Make a point, tell a story. Don't just make point after point and point. You put everybody to sleep.
Can I keep you at your father for a moment? Because the way you describe it initially, your father being an admiral in the Navy, that's something that for most Americans, they don't grow up with that experience. My father was in the Navy during the Vietnam War, but he was a dentist. He was not anywhere near that type of leadership position. I would love for you to give a little bit more, to the extent that you can or you want, about your father, because that's a really interesting, for people that are not familiar with the American military, that's up there. I mean, that's a lot of work to get to that position, many, many years. Can you speak to your father a little bit more, perhaps the influences upon you?
What was interesting about him, he's one of those, what they call great Americans, because he grew up at West Point, where the military academy is, where the Army officers are trained. And his father was a doctor there. And when he got out of high school, his dad said, "I think you should go away to school, son." And he just loved the West Point. And he said, "Well, if I can't go to the Naval Academy, to West Point, I'll go to the Naval Academy." And so he ended up going to where the Navy officers are trained. It was really quite an experience. But he graduated in 24, and World War I ended in 22. That was really kind of a time where they didn't need a lot of naval officers. So after his senior cruise, they let him out. January 25, he goes to Harvard Business School, and he gets a master's in finance, an MBA in finance. He goes down to Wall Street and works starting with Anaconda Copper, and then he went with National City Bank. They're about to make him a vice president, and he comes home at 1940. I was 1 year old. Said to my mother, "Well, I quit today." She said, "You did what?" He said, "I quit." She said, "To do what?" He said, "I rejoined the Navy." She said, "You got to be kidding me." He said, "Well, didn't I tell you if the country got in trouble, I thought I owed it something, and Hitler's crazy and the Japanese will be in this pretty soon." And so he goes from potential vice president to a second Louis, and they put him in Brooklyn Navy Yard. Pearl Harbor happens, and December 41, looks like he's going to stay there because he's 40 years old with no experience. So that was my dad's style. So he called one of his classmates who had stayed in, was the top guy at the Bureau of Personnel, said, "John, what do you got for an old guy with no experience? I got to get in the action." And he said, "Let me check, Ted." And he called back a couple of days. He said, "All I have with a guy with your experience is a suicide group going into the Marshall Islands." And he said, "You got your man." He, of course, didn't tell my mother, but they gave him 12 LCIs, these landing craft infantry that went right into the beach and protected the Marines and the frogmen, which are the SEALs today. And about 70% of his men were killed or wounded, and somehow he survived, but was decorated all for kind of things that he did. And he came back and went back to National City for a couple of days, and came home and told my mother, "Well, I quit again." She said, "Why?" He said, "Oh, a bunch of draft dodgers there." So he stayed in. They kept on moving up in rank, and made a whole career out of it. But late, because the wartime bumped his ranks up, because they had to bump him up to give him 12 ships. They made him a commodore, and then he made him a commander, and then up the line. But he was an amazing guy, tremendous integrity and values. He said to me, "Ken, that when all is said and done, all you have is your integrity, your word." He just was amazing. And he said, in terms of my work in servant leadership, he said, Ken, it's a myth that in the military it's my way or the highway. He said, because if you acted like that, he said, you were in battle, your men would shoot you before the enemy. He said, I was only as good as the chiefs that I had, the people around me who had all the information and could guide me. And he said, don't think like all the brains are in your office, you know. And so he kept on working me.
How do you think he was, at least as you tell the story, he sounds very even-keeled. A lot of things change in his life. He moves from one thing to the other. He's going down the Navy path, stops, gets back on the Navy path. But speak to that even-keeledness, because I see it in you too.
He really taught me that in life, you know, you never know what might happen, and you got to be ready to go. You know, I mean, like, you want to hear a fun story about me? When I was an undergrad, I got interested in. I was running a dormitory as a student, you know, as a kind of a resident advisor, and so I got interested in student personnel, you know, being a dean of students, and so that's why I went to grad school, you know, and it was interesting. But all my faculty members, when I was going through my master's degree program, then I said, I'm ready to go to be a dean. They said, well, you need to get a doctor's degree. And I said, doctor's degree? How am I going to do that? Those people are really bright. And so I found that graduate school is more endurance than it is intelligence. A lot of people couldn't make it because you get hit a lot, and you have to know whether you're going to get up. And my dad always told me, you know, if somebody hits you, get on up, you know, get on your feet and get going again, you know, don't stay down there and moan and groan. So when I got out of school, they said, if you want to be at a university, you should be an administrator, you know, not a faculty member, because you can't write. So my first job, I ended up being assistant to the dean of the business school at Ohio University. And when I got there, he said, Ken, I want you to teach a course. I want all my deans to teach. And Paul Hersey had just arrived at Ohio U as the chairman of the department. He put me in Hersey's department and gave me a course in management. Well, I had studied leadership and management, so that wasn't any problem. After a week or so, I came home and told my wife, I said, man, this is what I ought to be doing. I ought to be teaching. This is fabulous. She said, well, what about the writing? Because, you know, in universities, if you don't publish, you perish. And I said, I don't know, we'll work that out. But I heard Hersey taught a great course. In December 1966, I go up to him and say, Paul, do you mind if I sit in your course next semester? He said, nobody audits my course. You want to take it for credit, you're welcome. He walked away, and I thought that was really something. But I found out later that he just felt if you audited, you wouldn't do anything, you know. He was really something. So I ended up taking his course and writing the papers. And in June 1967, he comes into my office. Ken, he said, I really would love to have you work with me. I say, he said, they want me to write a book, and I'm kind of a nervous wreck. I'm not so good at that, but I've been looking for a good writer like you. Would you write a textbook with me? And I said, wow, that ought to really be fun. You know, you're not supposed to write, and neither am I. So we ended up writing a textbook. It came out a year or so ago, and the 10th edition probably sells more today than it, you know, did then. It was really an interesting journey.
Let me jump you ahead a little bit and get you closer to 1982. Your life really probably starts to change dramatically. I mean, maybe your way you carry yourself and the way you think, but in terms of that probably stays the same, of course. But in terms of notoriety, in terms of people knowing what you're doing, your influence on a larger population, this starts to really change with the release of The 1 Minute Manager in 1982, right?
Yes, for sure. What really happened is, who would have ever thunk it, you know? I mean, we were a couple of unknown guys. We met in November of 1981 and had a draft written by the time we went to the Rose Bowl in December. And people loved it. And I said to Spencer, let's go to New York and get a contract. He said, no. He said, they'll beat us up and take all the money. They don't know us. He said, we ought to self-publish it. So we ended up self-publishing the book ourselves before we went to New York. We sold 20,000 copies with no advertising.
So hold on. So when you went to New York, you had a lot of leverage after selling 20,000 self-published.
Yes. And well, at that time, see, nobody had written any real parables for management at that time. And Spencer and I love Jonathan Livingston Seagull and The Littlest Prince, and Og Mandino is the greatest salesman and all. That's why we thought we'd write a story. He's a children's book writer, and I'm a storyteller, so let's write a parable. We didn't realize what an impact that would have because people were tired of reading long books, and you'll get a kick out of this. Year before, all the bestsellers were about Japanese management, and I think the U.S. market was just tired of that. What about us? The 1 Minute Manager came out at the same time as Tom Peters and came out with In Search of Excellence, and John Nesbitt came out with Megatrends, and the three of us dominated the bestseller list. The business books had never done that.
Let me ask, were you able to, I assumed, but having pre-sold those copies before going to New York, were your conversations and your negotiations different when you got to the big publishers in New York City? Did you truly have some leverage?
Yeah, because we had a track record. We already had endorsements from corporation presidents, and so we were at a different kind of league. But it was funny. We were selling the book for $15.95, and it wasn't even 100 pages long. And one of the publishers, no, the price is too high, and Spencer would kind of get up and go to the door and look at these people. He said, "This must be Little League, because if two unknown guys can sell 20,000 at $15.95 and you can't, we got the wrong publisher." And, and when we got to William Morrow, when he gave his little speech, the president of Morrow, Larry Hughes, jumps up and says, "Lock the door, don't let him out of here. He's absolutely right. We got to figure this out, We put a little thing on the front of the book that said, "Small, expensive, but invaluable." Just so people knew that we knew it was a high price in those days, but that was a hardback for $15.95. Today it'd probably be $25 or $30.
Let me ask about the title, because this is an interesting title. I think even for today, if someone has not yet read the book, or if they hear the title, 1 Minute Manager, that brings up ideas in people's craniums that they probably get it wrong just instinctively, because the title doesn't tell you what it really is. So talk to me about the development of the title and perhaps any confusion that you saw early on were people debating the title with you?
No, well, Spencer was working on this thing called the 1 Minute Scolding with a psychiatrist. When he came running up after that, said, "Forget parenting, do the 1 Minute Manager." And we thought, wow, that's really neat, because what really sells books is to intrigue people. And you say, the 1 Minute Manager, well, how could you manage in a minute? I'd really like to see what they have to say about that. And I think the title was on our on our radar really well.
Why don't I let you go ahead also, for the audience that has not yet read, or those that need a reminder, there were really 3 very key, simple secrets that really drove your book. Why don't you speak to those?
We kind of looked at, what are the key things to managing people? And the first one was 1 minute goal setting. All good performance starts with clear goals. If people don't know what you want them to do, how are they going to end up doing it? 1 minute goal setting was the first secret. But once goals are clear, we thought you ought to wander around and see if you can catch people doing something right and accent the positive and give them a 1 minute praising. I tell you, of all the things I've ever taught over the years, if somebody said to me, "Blanchard, I'm going to take everything away from you, but one thing," the one thing I would hold on to is 1 minute praising, because I think that if you want to build a great organization or have great people, you got to catch people doing things right.
Yeah, and you were talking about the 1 minute praisings, and is that something that to not take away from you?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's just so important. So many organizations, I ask people, how do you know whether you're doing a good job? Nobody's yelled at me lately. No news is good news. Unfortunately, the biggest style around the world is what I call seagull management. The manager's not around until you make a mistake. Then they fly in, make a lot of noise, dump on everybody, and fly out. Not a really fun place to be. And so I think if you're in an environment that accents the positive, people want to be there. But if people make a mistake, you shouldn't ignore it. We said the third secret is the 1 minute reprimand. Now, we've rewritten the book recently, a couple of years ago. We changed that to 1 minute redirects. But either way, it was really saying to the person, here's what I've noticed about your performance. It's not up to the what we agreed upon. And I want to know if you're noticing that too. And I'd like to see if I can help you get back in line. It's really more of a redirection than a reprimand, but Spencer really kind of liked the concept of a reprimand with his 1 minute scolding.
Ken, speak to the time component here. 1 minute. Speak to the shortness in terms of praise or reprimand. Now, I think instinctively we would all think, well, gosh, nobody wants to be reprimanded for longer than it has to be. 1 minute sounds good to me. 1 minute praise also, well, that seems a little more less instinctive because, well, hold on. If somebody wants to give me praise, I'll take it for a lot longer than a minute. Not necessarily a good idea, huh?
No, it's just, how long does it take you to really notice, somebody and say, I just want to tell you, I just noticed what you did, and boy, it really made me feel good, and I just appreciate your efforts. And you don't want to go on and get super gushy, but you want to be specific, tell them what they did right, but you don't have to, do that. And so you could wander around and give a number of praisings because Tom Peters always said the key to being a great manager is to manage by wandering around, I think the myth about how long it takes to reprimand or redirect somebody and all is just it's a myth. It doesn't have to be a long one, but as long as you're specific, it was funny. I had one guy that at the holiday season now, he would go around his company and shake hands with everybody in the company and just say, just appreciate your efforts, thanks a lot. And he would go on to the next person, appreciate your efforts, thanks a lot. And he got sick one holiday season. He couldn't make the round, so a guy put a mask on and went around and said to people, appreciate your efforts, thanks a lot and all. And everybody just laughed because it didn't have any meaning, because he didn't know anything about what anybody was doing, It was just kind of like a shower. You got to be specific, and when you're specific, that's really powerful for people.
Let me take it big picture for a moment and get away from some of the specifics. I'm going to bring you back there too in a moment. But big picture, great managers are trained, not born. I see this in my field too, in the investments field. People wonder about great investors. You can even think of somebody like Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger. It all is about training. I think across all disciplines. If you ask people about natural talent, or if there's such a thing, it seems like the vast majority of people reach for, well, that guy is a natural investor, or he's a natural manager, or he's a natural athlete. But you speak to the idea of training. And I think it's something that as a society, we've all gotten a little messed up on, that if you really want to go down the path of any path, and you push and push and push, and you practice and practice and practice, you can excel. How do we get that all wrong?
People say, are good leaders born or they made? It's a combination. I mean, I will say some people, like my dad, just had a natural flair for people. He loved people, and he could bring out the best in them. Now, he said he learned.
Who did he learn from, though, right?
Yeah. Well, he learned at the Naval Academy.
There you go.
Most of us really could use some training. I think people need to, first of all, know what leadership is, practice it, wander around and try to do it and model it and all. And it's a journey. So I think training can really help people, and you can become better. We have a master's degree program at the University of San Diego, and it's in leadership, and the students are all in their mid-30s and higher, and they say, wow, I wish I had learned some of this sooner, because a lot of times we assume that a good performer, somebody's a good salesperson, will be a good sales manager. That's not necessarily so, because that's a completely different trait. Being an individual contributor is different than managing people. That's where the training has to come in, and so people can see things differently.
I would love for you to at this moment to give a little perspective on constant learning, because we're covering some decades here, and you've never stopped. You just keep going, and you keep learning, and you keep growing. And the question I have is why?
I wrote a book with Norman Vincent Peale. Wrote The Power of Positive Thinking. He was 86 years old when I wrote with him. I was in my early 40s. Norman said, if you stop learning, lie down and let them throw the dirt on you because you're already dead,
I love it.
And I just never forgot that, because he was learning right up to when he died at 95. And he's been a great inspiration for me. I'm 78 now, and people said, when are you going to retire? I said, why would I retire? I'm having too much fun. I'm learning too much stuff and all. And I just think that I wrote a book with Mark Miller, who's was the head of training at Chick-fil-A, called Great Leaders Grow. And we just were arguing because we've just really seen that the best leaders we've seen are people who are constantly trying to get better and learn. And I think you need to. I wrote a book recently called Refire, Don't Retire. Make the rest of your life the best of your life, And I was on the phone when I turned 65 with, remember Zig Ziglar? Ziggy invited Margie and I to the 69th anniversary of his 21st birthday or something. And I said, Ziggy, you going to retire? He said, there's no mention of it in the Bible. Except for Jesus, Mary, and David, hardly anybody under 80 made an impact. He said, I'm refiring, not retiring. I thought, wow, that really is powerful. And so I ended up writing a book about that. And what's so interesting is I thought it mainly would be for senior citizens, and they were giving it to all their kids in their 20s and 30s who they thought were getting in a rut. And it was really exciting. I just think it's so important to learn. And in the Refire book, we look at 4 areas for learning. What are you doing to grow intellectually with your mind? That's really important. What are you doing to grow physically? Keep yourself in shape and all that. What are you doing spiritually? Because you ought to, get out of your own way and realize maybe you're not the most important thing in the world. And then finally, what are you doing around relationships? It's a constant thing of keep on refiring yourself, and so I'm really excited about refiring. My wife, is a little year younger than I am, but she used to be president of the company, and she stepped down a number of years ago because I came up with a belief with a guy from Europe who I was writing a book with, Terry Waghorn, that you really have to do 2 things in organizations. You have to manage the present and create the future. And you make a mistake in an organization to send people who have present responsibilities off to plan your future, because they'll kill your future because they're either overwhelmed with the present or have vested interests in it. You ought to have a separate group that's in charge of the future. So my wife stepped down as president. She got a think tank of group that had no operational responsibility. A full-time job was to study our industry, study technology and all. And so it's been tremendous advantage for us over the years. When 9/11 happened, a lot of our competitors had real problems because they only did face-to-face training. Well, we knew all about online training and all kinds of stuff because of the Office of the Future. So that's that. And so she's an amazing learner. She's always, turning another rock over.
It's one of those reminders that everyone needs to hear, that somebody that is a few years older has never stopped. And so then if somebody's much younger and they say, I've learned enough. No, you haven't. You can't stop. If you want to compete with the best, you got to keep going. That's the way it works. I've got this, I've most recently gone through your book, Self-Leadership and the 1 Minute Manager. And there's there's 2 quotes in there that I love. They kind of connect. An assumed constraint is a belief that limits your experience, and not realizing your own power could be your greatest assumed constraint. Why don't you first talk about the notion of an assumed constraint?
We kid, and the environmentalists have been picking on the elephants in the circus and all, but it's really interesting, when they first get an elephant, they tie him up to a stake and a rope, and the elephant tries to pull and can't do it. They're not strong enough. And now the elephant's huge and thinks they can't pull the stake up. They could pull that stake out in a heartbeat, but it's an assumed constraint from the past, And I think that's what you have to do, is you have to watch the messages that people give you, that they, kind of label you what you can do, just like people saying, I'm sorry, you can't write. And that was a consumed constraint until I realized that was stupid. How do I move through that? Rather than not being able to write, that's just become one of my favorite things. I think assumed constraints are often, messages put in your head by your parents and other adults when you were young. So that's where it all start. And once you got that under control, then we say, well, most people are afraid to ask for what they need to win because they don't think they have any power. They assume that if the boss has power, a coach has power and all this kind of thing. They don't realize that we all have power. If people like to be around you, you have personal power. If you're good with technology, you have technical skill and power. And if, there's a whole bunch of it. So we try to have people look at what kind of power bases they have and how do they increase them. And then finally, the last one is how do you ask for what you need? We use our situational leadership model to help them analyze what's their development level and how do they get the help that they need to succeed, And so it's fun. I use that on my own health. When I got Joy, and she was such a joy in my life, this dog, and I realized that she's small. She probably lasted 16 years, 17 years. And by the time that was, I'd be 86, 87, and she gets so excited. She can tell my car's coming down the road even before I get in here. She comes racing down the hall, and I didn't want her to be racing down the hall, and I wasn't going to be there, A lot of people say, Blanchard, you're something. Most people worry about losing their dog, not their dog losing them. But so I decided to get myself in shape, and I went to a guy I'd met at West Point. It's one of the heads of their whole physical fitness training, and he told me that there's 6 parts of healthy lifestyle, and one is aerobic, what are you doing for your heart? Then there's strength training, then there's balance, flexibility, diet and weight control, and sleep. And so I went through and looked at what was my development level, and the only one I was fully developed on is sleep. I can sleep at the drop of a hat, But the other ones, I had to look for somebody who would give me the leadership style I needed. So, like, I had never done anything with strength training, so I needed a lot of direction and supervision. In aerobic, I had been in a lot of different jogging programs and all, and so I really needed somebody to support me, and I needed a walking partner, a running partner. You got to do it. We say to people, if you ask somebody to help you and they say they can't, they didn't turn you down. They just turned your proposition down. Nobody can turn you down without your permission. Eleanor Roosevelt said that years ago. Nobody can make you inferior without your permission.
It's so beautiful to hear just that common sense wisdom. And you just say it and you hear it. It's reminders that we don't hear in everyday society anymore. In everyday society, all we hear about, if you turn on the news, is the latest who knows what crazy behavior of some politician or some Hollywood person did. That's all we ever hear about. We don't hear about the common sense good stuff.
That really is a problem, I think, in our country, and I think around the world. You don't ever hear any good news. And some people say it's our fault because we don't want to listen to good news, but I did a session recently for a group called First Tee, and they teach kids in urban areas about character and values through golf, And they've impacted in 20 years 10 million kids. And you should have heard the stories that I heard from these kids about what's happened in their life. I said, how come I never heard of this thing? What a great new story this is.
Wouldn't it be nice on the nightly news, the ABC, NBC, CBS, instead of starting with the daily news of whatever, just start with that story? I think people would love it.
Yeah, we love the Sunday morning news, CBS morning news, with that good gal, because that's all that is good news. So we watch that before we go to church. Jane Pauley runs that, but it really is true. Even in our country now with President Trump, he's got some issues and problems and all, but nobody's caught him doing anything right.
Yeah. Let me shift you into, Ken, as we wind down. We've only got so much time left. Self-leadership. I can tell you something about myself. I'm in my late 40s, 50s soon, and I'm a guy that grew up at the start of the internet. So right there when Netscape was going public, I was like, okay, I'm just getting out of grad school. I've got nothing. I'm putting up a website. Boom. So my thinking all along has been this entrepreneurial thinking, not be associated with a large company. And I have to say, there was probably some hesitation in me in diving into your world because I thought, well, gosh, why is this going to be useful for me? Because this is more large corporate management leadership. I dive into your world and I'm like, Oh my gosh, this is exactly what we all need, regardless of, whether or not you're self-leadership or whether with a large company. It's what we all need.
I think people that don't admit that they need this have an ego problem. I started a 12-step Egos Anonymous program, where people get focused either in false pride where they think more of themselves than they should, and they're putting people down, or self-doubt and fear where they think less of themselves than they should, and they're kind of cowering and all that kind of thing. And I just think that, as we were saying earlier, if you stop learning, you're in trouble. You just need to open your mind and say, and that's the same way. The great leaders I've seen, I wrote a book with Colleen Barrett, who stepped in to be president of Southwest when Herb Kelleher decided to step down. And she has a great saying. She said, "Ken, people admire your skills, but they love your vulnerability. And to admit that you don't know everything, that you could learn something. I mean, rather than people saying, God, he's the leader, how come he's so dumb? They're going to go, wow, isn't that great? Now I can make a contribution and all." And Brene Brown, who's a really big person now in our country, she did a TED Talk on vulnerability. And God, I don't know how many millions and millions of people watched that thing to realize that being vulnerable is not a weakness. It's actually a strength. In fact, she says it takes courage.
It's a fascinating path you've gone down. I would love for you to reach back into the memory banks. I know you've had a chance to inspire so many people with your wisdom, your vulnerability, your content. But are there any particular people, they don't have to be a well-known name, it could be somebody, because I know with your type of career, you've shifted other careers. You've allowed people to build off your work and go in directions that perhaps they didn't expect if they had not come across your work. Are there any great stories or individuals that you can recall that you really feel so proud that or happy that they found your work, and then they took it and they built off it and went in such a great direction? Look, I know it's more than one person, but I'm curious if you've got any in mind that might be fun to share with the audience.
I started to work, and we started to work with Ken Chenault, president of American Express, when he wasn't president. And then the minute he became president, he continued to work with us. In fact, when we would do a new sermon or new seminar or learning experience, he'd always be the first one in the first row. And he's just retiring now, and everybody's saying, God, he's got to be one of the great CEOs of all time. And I think it's not because he got trained by us, because he got trained by a lot of people, but his openness to learn and to realize that he still could learn new things and all that. I mean, he's one that really kind of stands out on me. And he African American, the probably highest ranked African American CEO in the country, and just unbelievable openness to learning. And I think that's a really exciting stuff, and look at Herb Kelleher and Colleen Barrett from Southwest. They're always open to new learning. And there's no accident that Southwest is the only airline that's made any money over the years. A lot of people don't know they're 87% union. It's the biggest union shop in the country. But when they were going to vote on unions, they came to Herb and he said, God, I love unions as long as they let you sit on the same side of the table from me. Is if they want you to sit in the opposite table, vote against them. And the union leaders are there at every meeting I've ever been, even voting the salary cuts to deal with the gas crisis. And, I just really see them, as models of saying, well, I don't know anything. I need everybody. I need all of you to be the best. I just love that stuff. I've worked with Wegmans grocery chain. They were chosen the number one company in to work for in the country by Fortune, and just amazing. I was asked to speak when the founder stepped down and his daughter was going to take over, and at her first big meeting, and the founder decided not to come. He said, I don't want to take anything away from her. She's in charge now. She's the leader and all. I mean, how many people would do that, The absolute best leaders are the ones that Greenleaf, talked about. Robert Greenleaf, he said that they serve first and lead second.
Ken, I have one final question, and it's kind of a wider issue beyond America. We mentioned in the beginning of the conversation Singapore, and I know your books have been translated. I think the number I'm seeing most recently is 42 languages, but it probably goes up every day. I would love for you to kind of contrast and compare. I find, having been outside the States for multiple years, I find in some of the growing, vibrant cities around the world, I find an energy that sometimes I think we as Americans, maybe we've dialed it back a little bit, because I find the enthusiasm in some really growing areas outside the States. It's quite amazing. I'm curious if you would talk about the acceptance of your work outside the States. Obviously, I mentioned the translations, but the personal experiences you've had with the acceptance of your work.
I was on a program one time with Lee Kuan Yew from Singapore, and he's a perfect example of managing consequences, because he had a vision for Singapore and what he wanted that country to be, and he said, here's our goals and here's what good behavior looks like. And I don't want our streets to be all messy and all. So if you litter and you're caught, it's a $500 fine. If you don't have the money on you, you go to jail, he was, and yet when people were really good, he would praise them and all that kind of thing. It's just, that's why 1 minute goal setting is the first secret. You need to set a vision and a goal of what, and then catch people doing things right. And if they don't do it right, then redirect their energy. And I've just been amazed every time I've been in Singapore about what a wonderful place to be and the positive energy in that place, and a lot of different nationalities and all living there. And it's just great. So when you see that in a country, it's really exciting, and so I think that's the kind of thing that we need more of.
I find when I talk with my Singaporean entrepreneurial friends, it's the closest kinship that I have in terms of that business conversation than with Americans. I mean, they're right there, if not beyond. You bring up Lee Kuan Yew, something, a cool point for people to check out. There are some old black and white Meet the Press interviews that you can find on from NBC on YouTube, where he's speaking in the 60s. Fantastic oratory, just great.
Yes, unbelievable, and you see that, like Rwanda, where they had this genocide, and 20 years ago, and then they got a different leader, and that whole thing is turned around. Rick Warren's over there and all kinds of things. I mean, that's becoming one of their goal is by 2025 that they might be, the Singapore of Africa, just change the leader. Look at Colombia was really a problem. Then they got a new leader, and Colombia's just really turned around tremendously, and the leader has got to be somebody who has vision. And also, it's not about them. They're not building themselves up. It's interesting. Jim Collins, when he did his study at Good to Great, he studied 25 or, a bunch of companies that we found were really great companies, and hardly anybody knew the leader, the president. It wasn't about them. It wasn't the Iacocas or the others that, are out front all the time. It's really interesting to see that, whether it's in a nationwide or in a business-wise, that the leaders who have vision, and it's not about them, it's about the people they're serving. What a difference that makes.
Ken, I can't keep you. I could ask you questions all day long. You need to go enjoy that San Diego sunset, hang out and relax some. But I appreciate you taking the time today. Great stuff. We covered a lot of wide territory. I'm most appreciative. Is there a place, Ken, for the books everywhere, Ken Blanchard, Amazon, you're going to find a ton of reading there. A best website that people can go to, Ken?
So we have a new website called KenBlanchardBooks.com. Yeah, a lot of people will say, God, I'd like to see all that. We got them divided, whether you're interested in customer service or self-leadership or team leadership.
Are you still keeping track of how many books you've written, Ken?
Well, other people are, but I haven't paid attention. It's supposedly over 60. But
60?
My mother used to say, "Why don't you write a book by yourself?" And out of those 60, I've only written 2 by myself, one on golf, because so many people helped my golf game, I didn't know who to write it with, and the other one was my spiritual journey. But I'm a learner, and I just love to learn from other people, so every other book I've co-authored with somebody, and so that's just a delight to me. I have a book coming out in March that's probably the best thing I've ever done. It's called Servant Leadership in Action, and I got 41 people to write short articles about what servant leadership meant to them, from people like Marshall Goldsmith and, Frances Hesselbaum, who ran the Girl Scouts, and all kinds of great people, Kuznets and Posner, and even Dave Ramsey, and just an amazing group of people who are Lencioni and all that. They did it because I'm a collaborator. I'm not a competitor. So it's really fun. It's coming out in March. And I think the world is in desperate need of a different leadership role model. And I just hope that this is a movement, not a book. And the royalties are all going to a servant leadership foundation where we're trying to build energy to send it around the world.
Well, Ken, you're a great inspiration, and I feel fortunate to have had you on. And if in the future, if you would ever like to have another conversation when the servant leadership book comes out, I'd love to have you on again.
God bless.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.